two men stand overlooking an empty field as the wind swept through the open air. His name was Suho Kim. Well, not here. In this world he went by Lloyd Frontera. And this was where his story began. Lloyd twirled a shovel in his hand before slamming it into the ground with theatrical flair. A pulse of blue light erupted from the point of impact, quickly spreading outward and enveloping the entire field. Glowing lines traced across the air, forming what looked like massive blueprints, an intricate three-dimensional schematic of a city taking shape right before their eyes. And so began the tale of an ordinary civil engineering student who transformed a world one plan, one step, one shovel at a time. Lloyd called out to the man beside him, Javier. With a glint in his eye, Lloyd declared that everything before them was money, and then let out a laugh more fitting for a villain than the story's protagonist. Javier stared at him, completely unfazed, and dryly remarked that his master had clearly lost his mind. The story starts just a few years ago in a small town in the country. A notification appears stating that someone has been chosen to have a random wish granted by the Absolute. It congratulates the recipient with a cheerful burst of applause, as if the system was trying its best to be encouraging. A man lies face down on the ground, staring at a glowing blue screen, still reading the notifications from earlier. It goes on to tell him he is now a character in Night of Blood and Iron. He lays there thinking. He knows the name. It was the book he read just last night before going to sleep. Another notification follows, wishing him good luck and saying he's got this, with a burst of celebratory confetti. His thoughts start to race. A wish? Good luck with what? Realization sets in. This is one of those tropes, the kind where someone ends up inside a novel. Then it hits him. He's face down in the dirt, on a road. He struggles to his feet, shivering from the cold. A sharp pain shoots through his jaw, and he quickly realizes he can't move his mouth. Just then, a notification pops up, informing him that he's dislocated his jaw from sleeping on the ground. With a grunt of frustration, he slaps the screen away, feeling like the notification is taunting him. He scowls, already convinced the system is getting way too much enjoyment out of his misery. He stands there for a moment, trying to make sense of it all. As he wonders what character he could possibly be, he presses a hand to his jaw and winces, carefully setting it back into place. A guy who wakes up with a sore jaw after a dirt nap in the middle of nowhere. Who else could it be? Master Lloyd, a voice calls out from behind, calm and direct, and mentioning that he's been looking for him. He turns, not entirely sure why anyone would be out here in the middle of nowhere looking for him. A man approaches, silver hair faintly catching the light, dressed in a crisp blue coat with an ornate sword at his side. The look is familiar. He recognises the character right away. Javier Asrahan. In the book, Javier was a renowned swordsman, but before that, he served as a low-ranking knight under a country lord, Arcos Frontera. That name ties everything together. The eldest son of that house was Lloyd, which means he's him, the hooligan of House Frontera. His face twists with rage as he shouts it, the words tearing out before he can stop himself, echoing into the empty countryside. Lloyd, still in shock, just stares at Javier. Javier looks back, unbothered, then comments that he never called him a hooligan. With a slight smirk, he adds that it's good to see he's at least self-aware. A notification pops up, noting that Javier's mood has improved. Lloyd doesn't even look at it. He mutters that he noticed, and tells it to shut up already. Later, back at the manor, the two sit near the fire. Javier is calmly stoking the flames while Lloyd remains wrapped in a blanket, still shivering. Javier glances over and asks if he seriously doesn't remember how he ended up like that. Then he lays it out. Apparently, Lloyd started drinking in the afternoon, got completely drunk, wrecked the furniture at the local pub, and passed out on the road while trying to stumble home. Lloyd, still half buried under the blanket, thinks that actually sounds about right for a hooligan. Javier tells him that his father had sent him out to look for him, apparently out of concern. Even if he was a hooligan, he was still the Lord's son, and if he died on the road with his jaw hanging loose, his father would have been sad. Lloyd glances at him, thinking Javier seems to be enjoying this a little more than necessary. The fire crackles quietly in the hearth. Lloyd, still bundled in the blanket, thinks the room is freezing. It could really use some underfloor heating, but this was a medieval fantasy after all. Javier stands and says he must return to report back to his father. Lloyd calls out, asking if his family has a lot of debt. Javier pauses for a moment, but doesn't give him a real answer, only brushing it off with a vague remark before leaving the room. Left alone, Lloyd sits in silence, still wrapped in the blanket. He knows exactly where this story is going. Just last night, cramped in his tiny boarding house room, he'd read the final chapter. He lets out a long sigh. His parents fall for a scam run by a local con man and lose everything. After that, they take their own lives. Lloyd ends up on the streets and eventually drinks himself to death. The thought surges through him all at once. He jumps to his feet, fists clenched in frustration. If everything was already decided, if he was just going to live the same miserable life all over again, then what was the point of any of this? He thinks back to the moment he first woke up in this world, the absolute, whatever that was supposed to be. And what kind of wish had he made that would drop him into a life with such a miserable fate? The next morning, his mother approaches him, clearly worried, and brings up the events from the night before. Lloyd, still feeling a bit unsteady, stands there quietly. He may not have been the one who caused the chaos, but he's the one living in the aftermath. So it's his problem now. She urges him to go to the pub and make things right. Lloyd sighs. It's not like he caused the mess himself, but someone had to deal with it. He agrees to go. His mother looks caught off guard. Javier glances at her, then back at Lloyd, like he's double-checking that he actually heard what he thinks he did. A notification appears, stating that confusion levels are currently high. Lloyd looks at the notification and thinks, was agreeing to apologise really that unbelievable? Or did they expect him to burn the pub down instead? The view shifts to the small, quiet town as Lloyd makes his way toward the pub. Along the street, a man is loading hay onto a cart. He glances up, then freezes. His eyes land on Lloyd and Javier walking side by side. Without hesitation, the man drops into a crouch and hides behind the wagon, curling up into a ball, clearly hoping Lloyd won't see him. Lloyd slows as he approaches, catching sight of the not-so-well-hidden figure behind the cart. He pauses, glances at the poorly hidden figure, then continues on, still a little confused. As he walks through the town, the reaction is immediate. People scatter at the sight of him. Some rush indoors, others cross the street entirely, avoiding eye contact like their lives depend on it. Lloyd glances around, brows drawing together as the confusion deepens. A child peeks through a window, curious about the sudden commotion, only to be yanked back by a parent who warns him not to make eye contact. The shutters slam, closed a second later. A notification appears. The villagers absolutely detest you. Lloyd gives the message a flat look and thinks to himself that yes, he'd already figured that part out. Continuing down the street, Lloyd glances at Javier and asks why he's still following him. Javier replies, calm as ever, that his father ordered him to escort Lloyd, just to make sure there were no repeats of yesterday. Lloyd blinks, genuinely surprised. What would he need an escort for? Javier clarifies, in his usual dry tone, that he's not here to protect Lloyd. He's here to protect the villagers from him. Lloyd pauses, eyebrows raised, then mutters to himself that he's being treated like some kind of gangster. He sighs. Maybe it was time to fix his reputation. At this rate, if he really did end up a beggar, he might at least want a shot at getting food and a warm drink out of it. No, he corrects himself. That's the wrong mindset. If he could just sort out the family's debt, he wouldn't have to live on the streets at all. He could stay right where he was, live out a cushy life as a baron, and actually make it to old age. He pulls up the screen in front of him, hoping there's something, anything, that might help him in this situation. And there it is. He does have a skill. 2, in fact. 1 passive, human scum. 1 activated, rowdy drunkard. His face twists into anger as he stares at the screen, jaw tight, and swipes at it with clear irritation, like the whole thing was some bad joke. Javier, walking quietly beside him, spares him a glance and wonders why Lloyd suddenly looks like he's fighting with the air. Javier calls out, motioning back toward the building Lloyd had just walked past, and reminds him of his promise to apologise. Lloyd explains he was just lost in thought, which is why he walked right past the pub without noticing. But Javier gives him a serious look. He doesn't say anything, just watches him, silently wondering if Lloyd really plans to go through with it. The look makes Lloyd nervous. He flusters under the weight of it, fumbling through his words until Javier sighs deeply and suggests they head in. Before he can finish, Lloyd's already reaching for the door, pushing it open without hesitation. Javier pauses at that. Strange. Ever since last night, Lloyd's been acting different, like someone else entirely. Lloyd steps into the pub. The damage is still everywhere. Tables lie broken, chairs overturned, wall decorations barely hanging. He walks straight up to the pub owner, bows his head, and asks, sincerely, for forgiveness. The pub owner's response is immediate. He jumps back into a defensive stance, hands up and trembling. A notification pops up. The pub owner has assumed the position of extreme high alert. The man begs him not to cause a scene. Lloyd, still bowing, blinks. Apparently, being polite is just making things worse. So he adjusts his tone and posture, deciding to act a little more like the scumbag everyone's expecting, just to put the man at ease. He straightens up, shrugs a little, and casually says something that vaguely resembles an apology. Another notification appears. Your apology does not seem genuine. Lloyd grits his teeth. Of course it doesn't, but he had to do something. The bartender, still clearly afraid, mutters that it's fine, more out of fear than forgiveness. Now walking back through town, Lloyd looked annoyed. He muttered that even though he apologised, the pub owner hadn't seemed happy at all. Javier, walking calmly beside him, replied that it was to be expected. Lloyd had destroyed everything in the place. An apology wasn't going to magically fix any of it. Lloyd frowned. Fair enough. But if words weren't enough, how could he repay the owner? He didn't have any money. What else did he have to offer? Javier added that the owner's mother had fallen ill after the harsh winter. With the damage to the pub on top of that, things must be difficult for him now. Lloyd thought back. The place had felt cold. One fireplace in that open space wasn't nearly enough. And elderly people couldn't handle the cold as well as others. Then it hit him. He stopped in his tracks. His expression shifted like something had just snapped into place, eyes wide, frozen mid-step. A light bulb moment. Blueprints began to take shape in his mind, lines of green energy sketching out the schematic right before his eyes. Heated floors. If he could build those here, in this world, they'd sell for sure. And there was no way the original Lloyd, the hooligan, would have come up with something like this. But he could. Suho Kim could. In his old life, he majored in civil engineering. He'd built a house by himself during his military service. He'd worked on construction sites, spent years learning exactly how things went together. He had the knowledge. And if he played his cards right, he could use it to clear the family's debt. He spun around and shouted to Javier that they were going back to the pub. Javier raised an eyebrow and asked why. But Lloyd didn't slow down. He walked with purpose now, eyes locked forward, voice steady. Today, he said, he was going to get his first order. A notification chimed. Your true journey has begun. The RP system has been unlocked. You can now earn RP by improving your relationships with other characters. Lloyd stared at the glowing message, still trying to wrap his head around it. The RP system, relationship points. He wasn't sure how it worked yet, but if this was the first step toward turning things around, then he was all in. Lloyd looks over at Javier and notices something new. There's a floating screen above his head. Taking a closer look, he realizes it's displaying Javier's approval rating. It's currently sitting at -30. Not exactly a surprise. This was Lloyd, after all. Hoping to bump it up a little, he decides to throw out a compliment. He tells Javier he's a handsome man. Javier, completely unfazed, responds flatly that he already knows. Lloyd watches in disbelief as the rating ticks down another point. He gets flustered. That dropped it? He sighs and turns away, muttering to himself that there really are no shortcuts to fixing relationships. We now return to the pub. Lloyd arrives looking unusually serious. He's prepared a contract, and he's now reading the terms aloud to the bartender. Once finished, he places the document on the table and asks him to sign. The pub owner just stares at him, like Lloyd must really think he's some kind of fool. A notification pops up. The pub owner is suspicious of you. Lloyd bemoans his reputation. Of course, no one would trust the infamous hooligan of House Frontera. Another notification chimes in. The pub owner is using the skill Stonewall Heart. Lloyd slumps a little. He can't afford to lose this chance. If being reasonable isn't working, then maybe it's time to channel his inner hooligan. He straightens up and puts on his best threatening face, telling the pub owner they'd be seeing a lot more of each other and that he should start trusting him. To his shock, the pub owner signs on the spot. A new notification appears, casually calling him a garbage human being. Lloyd stares at it, then grumbles that he didn't have much of a choice. Still, he did it. He actually got his first order. Grinning, he rolls up the contract, stuffs it into his coat, and tells the owner he made a smart choice. Javier watches from the side, his expression caught somewhere between disgust and curiosity. We cut back to the outside behind the pub. Javier calls out to Lloyd, asking why he's now resorting to threatening the pub owner, and whether this is just another round of him causing trouble. Lloyd turns his head and gives Javier a flat, disapproving glance, then says he's not being reasonable, and asks if he's ever heard of cognitive distortion. Javier tilts his head slightly, thrown by the term, and asks what that even means. Lloyd explains that people expect you to behave the same way you always have, that people are prejudiced. Javier replies without hesitation that it's not prejudice. Experience just teaches you to judge someone based on their actions. That's called common sense. Lloyd insists that people's minds can change and says he'll prove it. He's going to make them smile. Javier stares at him for a long moment. Lloyd had never spoken like this before, and now he was talking about making people smile. He honestly wasn't sure what was more surprising, that Lloyd had said it, or that he sounded like he meant it. Lloyd starts digging and tells Javier he'll begin with the pub owner and his mother. He'll make them smile first. He figures this will be the perfect foundation for profit and progress. He starts digging, a grin forming as he gets to work. Javier watches as the days go by. Bit by bit, something starts to take shape. A small structure, slowly forming. Then one day, Lloyd is flat on the ground, completely drained. He thinks to himself that his body is too weak to keep up with the demands of construction. Javier notes that he's making quick progress. Lloyd snaps back that he's been at it for a week already. Javier looks at the progress again. He can't believe it. Lloyd is actually building something. How did he learn this? Is he really going to follow through with the contract? The hooligan, Lloyd Frontera? He looks over again. Lloyd is now struggling to lift an axe, hands shaking just trying to stay upright. As he swings, barely able to keep hold of it, Javier steps in and grabs the axe mid-motion. He takes it from him calmly and asks what needs to be done. Lloyd tells him he needs small cuts, about 1 finger thick, and gives the precise measurements. Javier walks over to the logs, tosses a few into the air, and in a blur of motion, slices them down to exact size. Each piece drops neatly to the ground. Lloyd can only watch with his jaw hanging open, then gives him a shaky thumbs up. This guy really is the character who becomes the master swordsman in the book, he thinks, still amazed. Who needs machinery when you've got precision and speed like that? He walks up behind Javier and places a hand on his shoulder, looking unusually serious. Then he breaks into a wide smile and tells him he should help with the digging once he's done with the chopping. Javier doesn't even turn to look at him. Irritated, he thinks that after all that, Lloyd should be thanking him, not assigning more work, that man is truly hopeless. A notification appears. Javier regrets helping you. Lloyd leans in with a mischievous grin and tells Javier that he knows what he's thinking. That Javier is curious, wondering if this is all just some elaborate scam. And if he really wants to find out how it ends, then helping might get him there faster. Javier admits, at least to himself, that Lloyd isn't entirely wrong. He's changed more than expected in just a few days, but even so, after all the selfish things Lloyd's done over the years, how could he possibly trust him? Still, the two begin digging side by side. Eventually Lloyd lifts his shovel, gives it a twirl, and slams it into the ground with flair, declaring that the construction is complete. Javier looks at the plaque now hanging on the wall and asks what the symbols mean. Lloyd tells him it's his logo. Javier stares at it. He doesn't get it. Lloyd, still smiling, tells him that now that the work is done, maybe they should go and find out what kind of con he has in store for the pub owner. Javier looks at him with no expression, maybe just trying to hide how curious he actually is. We cut back to the house Lloyd had built. Inside, the pub owner and his mother are seated comfortably. The mother is lying on the warm floor, eyes closed and content. The pub owner is speechless. His mother tells him it feels lovely, warm all the way through. Her joints feel relaxed for the first time in ages. The pub owner can hardly believe what he's seeing. Lloyd stands nearby, smiling to himself. He thinks that for the people of this world, this must feel like magic. The pub owner turns to Lloyd, ecstatic, and thanks him, saying he hasn't seen his mother smile like this in a long time. Javier can't hide his emotion this time. He's in shock. Lloyd actually made them smile, just like he said he would. What is going on? First, his speech and manner changed. Now this? Now he works hard. He keeps promises. He follows through for other people. There's no way Lloyd Frontera would do something like this. And yet, it happened. Seeing them like this. Maybe that's what matters most right now, he thinks. A notification appears. Lloyd's approval rating with Javier has improved by 2 points. He's also earned 36 RP for improving a relationship with a key character. Lloyd just smiles and turns to Javier, clearly gloating, and says he's thinking it. Lloyd might not be a total garbage human after all, huh? Javier replies without blinking. As far as he's concerned, Lloyd's still garbage. Lloyd just grins and says he knows Javier's starting to think it. Javier snaps back that he is not. Lloyd doesn't seem fazed. He's clearly pleased, even though he spent money on timber. He's confident it'll pay off. This house will serve as a show model to help sell the idea to everyone else. A few days later, a line has formed outside the house Lloyd built. He's set up a station just out front, complete with a desk, a chair, and a stack of contracts ready to go. People step out of the house impressed, commenting on how warm it is inside. The crowd waiting in line watches curiously. And Lloyd. He's already working the scene, calling out to passers-by, letting them know they could have one just like it. He offers different models, custom layouts, even remodeling options for existing homes. One man hesitates, unsure. A notification pops up. The villagers don't trust you. Lloyd frowns, then puts on his best hooligan face and tries to pressure the man into signing. He insists it's an amazing deal. Before the man can answer, someone else approaches. Lloyd glances up and freezes. It's his father. His father walks up and asks what Lloyd is doing here. Lloyd doesn't answer right away. He glances at the screen. His father's approval rating sits at -20. He stays quiet, eyes on his father, watching him carefully. Because if there was anyone harder to win over than the villagers, it was him. The manor was quiet. Lloyd sat across from his father, picking at his food. He'd avoided this moment for as long as he could, but if the old man didn't approve his plans, things might get complicated. His father eyed him, suspicious as ever, and asked what he was scheming this time. Lloyd, keeping his voice steady, said he built the house because the landlord had already agreed to it in writing. But the man pressed further. What about the rest of the townspeople? Had they signed contracts too? Lloyd gave a casual nod and kept eating. His father sighed. They had a duty to protect their people, not trick them. He wouldn't tolerate abuse of trust. Lloyd told him not to worry. He was not planning to. He kept eating. It didn't matter what he did. People would still expect the worst. He stood up from the table. If there was nothing further, he would take his leave. But his father stopped him. Was this really about the family situation? He didn't need to get involved. Lloyd paused. He had heard those words before. Another life, another father. Back then, he had placed his trust in those words. Not this time. He told his father not to lose hope. He had no intention of doing so himself. As he left, one quiet thought stuck with him. He wished he'd said those words before too. As Lloyd walked through the manor, he mentally reviewed the contracts he'd secured so far, already thinking ahead to what needed to come next. That was when he spotted two unfamiliar men approaching from the other end of the corridor. They passed him without a glance. No bow, no greeting, nothing. Lloyd stopped. Guests of the house, and not even the courtesy to acknowledge the Lord's son. He glanced over his shoulder as they walked away. That couldn't be them, could it? He narrowed his eyes. Then it clicked. Those men, were they the ones from the story? The two men were now in his father's office, arguing with him. They demanded to know how much longer they'd be expected to wait. The agreed-upon date had already passed. One of them warned that if this dragged on any longer, they might have to take matters into their own hands. The other looked around the office and suggested selling some of the manor's belongings. Surely something here was worth a decent sum. From just outside, Lloyd leaned toward the slight gap in the door, a glint in his eye. Perfect. Right on time. He slipped away with a grin. Back in his room, Lloyd opened the RP system and stared at it. He wondered how exactly he was supposed to use it. As if on cue, the system chimed. A message appeared informing him he could invest his RP into abilities. Lloyd raised an eyebrow, so it actually did something useful for once. Usually it just mocked him. Another chime. This time, the system replied with a flat message. Forget it. Then, the interface blinked out entirely, like it had taken offence. Lloyd panicked and started apologising, begging the system to come back. Silence. Then, a loading circle appeared. The system seemed to be thinking it over. Without warning, a blue ring of light formed at his feet and swept upward, scanning his body. Text began scrolling in front of him. Skills detected. Soil mechanics, hydraulics, structural mechanics, water supply and sewage theory, steel structure design and concrete design, advanced design programming. The system chimed again, surprised that Lloyd was smarter than he looked. Lloyd snapped back, face twisted in offence, yelling that he had a degree, thank you very much. Another alert popped up. 2 skills were available for RP investment. Basic surveying, 15 RP. Basic design, 20 RP. Lloyd studied the options, thinking he had no idea what either one actually did. Still, he had the points. May as well try. He selected both. A sudden green glow burst from his body, momentarily blinding him. He stumbled to the window and threw it open. From his glowing eyes, projections shot out across the lawn, blueprints forming mid-air. Later, Lloyd was already experimenting with the new skills. A digital canvas floated in front of him as he traced building designs with a flick of his fingers. Much better than scribbling on paper. This would save a lot of time. Still, could Javier handle all the construction alone? Lloyd frowned deep in thought. It'd be a huge help if he could just summon some heavy machinery. He perked up. Seriously? The system began processing again. A new screen appeared. Random summon game. Lloyd raised an eyebrow. What was this? Gacha mechanics? He stared at the screen, half expecting it to be a trap to drain his RP. Another window popped up. Random summon, 50 RP. He sighed. He only had 1 point left. Still. What kind of summon could it be? Maybe something powerful, something useful. His eyes sharpened. If he wanted to find out, he'd need more RP. And to get that, he needed to raise his reputation with the key characters. We cut back to his father's office. The 2 men are growing impatient. The plump man leans forward with a sleazy grin and suggests that maybe they should start selling off the women tending to the Baroness, and, if it came to it, the Baroness herself. Lloyd's father stands up abruptly and shouts at him, demanding to know how he dares say such a thing. Then, a voice cuts in from behind the lender. Just because he lends money, does that give him the right to speak without manners? It's Lloyd. He stands right behind him, one hand casually draped over his shoulder. His gaze narrows as he looks down at him. The man jumps in shock, spinning around and demanding to know who he is. Arcos stares at Lloyd in disbelief, saying his name aloud. Recognition flashes across the lender's face. So he's the son with no manners. Makes sense. Only someone like that would barge into a meeting uninvited. Lloyd doesn't respond to the insult. Instead, he asks the man to show his warrant. The two men hesitate, clearly not understanding. Lloyd clarifies. He's invoking the Royal Family and Nobility Act, Article 3, Clause 6. As a noble, he has the right to protect the family's interests as vassals of the king, so unless they have a warrant, they're trespassing, which, by law, carries consequences. The two go pale. They claim they've never heard of such a law. Lloyd smiles coldly. Then they'll find out together. He calls through the half-open door. Javier steps inside, calm and composed. He gives Lloyd a respectful nod in greeting. Lloyd's grin twists. He gives the order, cut off the trespasser's arm. Without hesitation, Javier begins to draw his sword. The lenders recoil, shouting in panic. One of them yells that this is madness, that they'll report him to the authorities. Lloyd asks them, who do they think the judge will believe? 2 loan sharks or a baron? Javier advances. The men scramble for the door, yelling that Lloyd will regret this. Lloyd only laughs as they flee. His father, still stunned, calls out to him. What did he just do? They can't pay what the men want. Now it's going to get worse. Lloyd walks over to the desk and drops the sack he'd been holding. It hits the wood with a heavy clank. He explains. He was planning to hand it over after collecting payment from all the orders. It should be enough to cover most of this month's debt. Arcos stares at the bag, then at Lloyd. His voice is tense. Is Lloyd swindling the townsfolk? Before Lloyd can answer, Javier speaks up. He assures Arcos that Lloyd has not extorted anyone and that he'll personally see to it that Lloyd keeps every promise he made. Lloyd looks at his father's face. He sees it clearly. He trusts Javier. Lloyd bows, then tells his father he will take his leave. The two of them were now walking back from his father's office. Javier glanced at Lloyd and asked how he knew about that law regarding trespassers. Lloyd sidestepped the question, saying he must have read it somewhere once. In truth, he'd learned it from Javier. Back when he read the book, right after his parents passed, the loan sharks had gone so far as to try digging up their bodies to sell them. Javier hadn't hesitated. That was when he'd recited the law, word for word, then turned and took both their heads off in a single sweep. Later, Javier had stood before a judge and been found not guilty. Lloyd thought to himself, knowing this story was going to be useful. He figured a pop-up should be coming any second now. Right on cue, a chime rang out. A screen appeared in front of him. Reputation with Baron Frontera increased by 6. 60 RP earned. A wide grin spread across his face. Everything had gone exactly according to plan. Now he had enough to do the summon. Later that night, Lloyd made his way to a quiet spot on the estate. He looked around carefully, making sure no one was watching. Then he asked the system to start the summon game. A screen appeared, and he pressed start. A flash of light lit up the area. Digital cogs spun into place in front of him, growing more intricate by the second. He stared, mouth slightly open. Was this a magic circle? It looked dramatic. Cogs spinning, light flaring, gears grinding loudly, until he realised the magic circle itself was tiny, no larger than the palm of his hand. All this noise, for that. He frowned. It really was over the top for something so small. Then suddenly everything went silent, until a whoosh erupted from the circle. A creature burst out, head first, and landed on the ground with a soft thud. It looked up at Lloyd with bright eyes, clearly thrilled to see him. Lloyd, towering over it, scowled. All that for this? The creature's expression fell. Tears welled up in its eyes, devastated by the rejection. Lloyd turned to leave, disappointed, but behind him, the creature cried out, trying desperately to get his attention. Lloyd glanced back, confused. It seemed like it was trying to say something. He narrowed his eyes. It was trying to convince him it could be useful. He waved it off. What could it possibly do? The creature begged him to give it a chance. Lloyd crossed his arms. Show me then, he said, unconvinced. The creature fidgeted, then seemed to chew something. It spat out 2 damp, crumpled papers which landed with a soft plop at his feet. Lloyd crouched down and picked them up, frowning at the mess. He unfolded the soggy papers. It was some kind of user manual. Podong is an adorable hamster. Please give it lots of love. Feed it the enclosed seeds and it will change size. He looked at the small packet of seeds and poured them into his hand. The manual continued. The red seed makes Podong grow large. Duration, 12 hours. The blue seed shrinks it back to normal. Additional seeds can be purchased for just 1 RP. Lloyd glanced down at the creature. Just how big can you get? Podong squeaked something unclear, but Lloyd somehow got the message. See for yourself. He considered it. Hamsters were good at digging, weren't they? If it got close to his size, it might actually be useful. He fed Podong the red seed. Immediately, a pulse of energy surged from the creature. Lloyd, still crouching, was thrown backward by the blast of its sudden growth. He landed with a grunt, then looked up. His mouth dropped, eyes wide. 30 feet tall. Podong towered over him, a smug grin on its face. A chime rang out. A screen appeared. Podong has learned skill, level 1 digging. Podong demonstrated immediately, burrowing into the ground with impressive speed and ease. Another alert. Skill unlocked, level 2. Packing dirt. The hamster rolled across the soil, compressing the loose earth beneath it like a steamroller. Then a third alert. Skill unlocked, cheek pockets. Podong waddled over, cheeks bulging. It stopped in front of Lloyd and, splat, dropped a massive boulder at his feet, saliva trailing behind it like a wave. Lloyd was drenched, but he didn't care. He stared up at the giant hamster, soaked in drool, but grinning wide. These skills... This thing really was like having heavy machinery. As he walked back, Lloyd wondered how he was going to explain having a giant hamster all of a sudden. People might get suspicious. He smirked. He'd just carry around a tome and pretend to be a summoner, he thought. Then his thoughts shifted. He needed to sort out the labour for all the projects he had lined up. After some time, we cut back to Lloyd. He was now out in the countryside, addressing a group of men. He stood like a foreman, calling out that safety came first. The men, soldiers under the Baron's command, stood around looking confused, unsure why they were even there. Lloyd looked irritated. These guys were just a bunch of lazy bums in the book. He still didn't understand why the Baron kept them on. But he grinned. At least now he could put them to work and make them earn their pay. He shouted for them to listen up. Just because they were soldiers didn't mean they were exempt from labour. He thought back to his own time in the army. He'd spent more time digging holes and pulling weeds than doing anything heroic. He pointed at a pile of clay nearby and told them he'd dug it up himself the night before. Well, technically that had been Podong. But they didn't need to know that. He kept going, raising his voice. The estate was growing, and he needed their help to move that clay and support construction in the nearby village. The soldiers didn't look thrilled. He wasn't surprised. Someone approached from behind him. Lloyd turned his head. A man stood there, in one he recognised immediately. It was the senior knight, Lord Neumann. He asks Lloyd what he's doing with his men. Lloyd grins. Just as expected. Here he is. He knew Neumann would have a problem with this. There were 3 knights serving under the Baron. At the top was Neumann, then Bayern beneath him, and last in the pecking order, Javier. In the book, when the estate fell, Javier and Bayern had stayed loyal until the very end. But this guy, he was the first to jump ship and run. Lloyd knew Neumann had been selling information about the Baron to the con men, and that didn't sit right with him, especially not from the estate's highest-ranking knight. Lloyd turned to Neumann. What did it look like he was doing? Neumann, unimpressed, told him this was no place for a soldier, and he wouldn't tolerate it. Lloyd hunched over, resting his arms on his spade with an unamused look. In truth, he thought Neumann was only angry because this little work detail was disrupting his shady dealings with the loan sharks. He told Neumann he had his father's permission. Neumann shot back that he must have tricked the Baron, because anything Lloyd did was for personal gain. Lloyd shrugged. That sounded about right. But to insult the Baron's son? Did he want a pummeling? Neumann's blood boiled, his mouth clenched. Veins popped at the edge of his forehead. Lloyd thought his ego was so fragile he wouldn't last a minute gaming online. He slammed his shovel into the ground and grinned. Time to press a few buttons. Then he flung a shovelful of dirt straight at Neumann. The men around them were in shock. Neumann struggled to keep himself together, shouting that Lloyd was a scoundrel for daring to insult a knight's honour. He told Lloyd he was nothing, and he'd be even less once the estate fell. Lloyd cupped his ear, mocking him, then called out for him to put their ranks aside and settle it directly. He spun the shovel once in his hand, then pointed it at Neumann. "Let's have a duel," he said, full of confidence. Neumann stared in disbelief. He told Lloyd he'd regret this. Back at the manor, Lloyd was talking to Javier about what happened with Neumann. Javier informed him that the duel had been scheduled. It would take place in 1 month's time. He looked to Lloyd with a hint of concern and asked if he really thought he could win. Lloyd, leaning back against the bed, scoffed. Of course not. The guy was a knight, an expert swordsman. Lloyd, just a nobody. The son of a baron with no real combat skills. He taunted Javier, asking if he was stupid for even thinking he stood a chance. Javier's blood boiled. His hand went to his sword, but he stopped himself. Something wasn't right. He threw dirt at Sir Neumann, then challenged him to a duel. At first, Javier had assumed Lloyd was just being a fool again, but now he wasn't so sure. He even assigned Bayern to supervise the soldiers, like this had all been planned from the start, and now he was acting like he had no chance of winning. It was almost coordinated. That meant either Lloyd was bluffing, or worse, scheming. He looked over at him again, only to see Lloyd holding a booger on the tip of his finger. Disgusted, Javier thought how filthy he was. He wished he could just cut him down where he stood. Lloyd, now casually wiping the booger off his hand, told Javier he had a task for him. He grinned and asked him to teach him how to use a sword. Javier's eyes narrowed, unamused. He flatly refused. Lloyd groaned. Why not? Javier gave him 2 reasons. First, his job was to make sure Lloyd didn't go around wreaking havoc in town. Second, if he taught a scumbag like Lloyd to fight, all it would do was put more innocent lives in danger. He took offence. In protest, he reminded Javier that he was a gentleman, and he shouldn't talk like that to his employer. Leaning in with a grin, he asked if that was really his final answer. He wouldn't teach him, not even if it meant he could cure his insomnia. Javier froze, trying to keep his cool. How did he know about that? Lloyd leaned back, still smiling. It was all in the book. He even knew the cause of Javier's insomnia. In the Night of Blood and Iron, knights were ranked by sword level. From the bottom, low-level sword expert, mid-level, high-level, and finally, swordmaster. Javier was already high-level, and just on the verge of becoming a master. His senses were sharpening, nearing superhuman levels, and he couldn't fully control them yet. That was the cause. One of the side effects of evolving as a swordsman. Not that Javier would ever figure that out on his own, out here in the sticks. He tilted his head, asked if they had a deal or not, and told him to stop pretending. He could read him like a book. Javier sighed. After a pause, he agreed to at least try. Lloyd beamed and told him he couldn't back out now. Javier smirked. Of course. He already knew Lloyd was going to fail. He'd tried everything. There was no way he could cure his insomnia. Sometime later, Javier was sitting in a rocking chair, fast asleep, snoring gently like a baby. Lloyd stood over him, arms crossed, laughing to himself. He knew him too well. In the book, the first time Javier ever dozed off was when he heard someone reciting a magic spell. So what did he do? He'd pulled out one of his old textbooks, something long and dull about reinforcing concrete, enough to put anyone out cold. And just like magic, here they were. Grinning like a maniac, he thought to himself, now your swordsmanship is mine. The next day, a refreshed-looking Javier stood in the training pit, watching as Lloyd arrived. He told him to start with 50 laps around the perimeter. Lloyd was not amused. He hesitated, then started running as Javier watched in silence. After just one lap, Lloyd came back around and told Javier he didn't like exercising and demanded to learn some sword skills instead. Javier ignored him. Lloyd huffed and continued on for another lap. When he came around again, he pointed at Javier and said he saw through his game. He figured Javier thought he'd give up if he made it hard enough. Another lap passed. Lloyd kept going, picking up the thread of his argument as he ran. He said Javier probably couldn't wait to tell him he didn't have what it takes. Javier flinched slightly. Lloyd noticed and grinned. Gotcha. He kept going, now wearing a proud smile, and called out, asking what Javier was going to do once he finished all the running. As he pushed forward, a familiar chime rang out. A screen appeared in front of him, alerting him that his passive skill, Annoying Brat, had increased to level 4. He stared up at it, face twisting in frustration, and shouted at the system to stop making up random skills. Now panting from the effort, Lloyd thought to himself, this wasn't easy, but life wasn't so bad. Back in Korea, he had lived in a tiny room. No family. By day, he carried bricks up 4 floors to a rooftop. By night, he loaded and unloaded delivery trucks. It was a desperate routine, just to stay off the streets to avoid starving. The future had always looked bleak. No matter how hard he worked, nothing ever changed. But now, there was something just barely within reach. Compared to before, this pain was nothing. By the time the sun had set, Lloyd was still running. Javier stood in the same spot, quietly watching him. He had to admit it. If Lloyd was working this hard, maybe he did deserve a shot at learning sword techniques. A notification popped up in front of Lloyd. Approval rating with Javier has increased by 1 point. Current standing, -28. 18 RP gained. Back at the manor, Lloyd's father sat in his study, speaking with Neumann. He told the knight he was disappointed, deeply dismayed that Lloyd would show such disrespect towards someone who had served their family for so long. He had thought Lloyd had changed his ways. Apparently, he'd been mistaken. But even so, the duel would go ahead. After what happened, Lloyd had no right to be shielded from the consequences. He only asked one thing, not to hurt him too badly. He was still his heir. Just knock some sense into him. Neumann bowed in acknowledgement, but as he turned to leave, darker thoughts filled his mind. Duels didn't always go smoothly. Accidents happened all the time, and if the Baron got in the way, he'd kill him too. The Baroness as well. It wouldn't be hard to stage something that looked like an unfortunate incident. He was going to leave eventually anyway. As soon as he made enough coin selling secrets, he'd be gone from this backwater village and off somewhere better. Thanks to that idiot's son, things had simply moved up ahead of schedule. If the duel went as planned, Lloyd would be dead, and if anyone tried to interfere, they'd join him. Then he'd take what he could and disappear, just as he always intended. 1 month later, the day had arrived. Lloyd and Neumann stood in the training ring, a wide circle of packed dirt surrounded by an eager crowd. Word of the duel had spread, and everyone, from estate staff to townsfolk, had gathered to watch. Lloyd's father and mother sat on a platform, unease written clearly on their faces. Behind them stood Javier and Bayern, both silent. Neumann stood with practised calm, sword in hand. His posture was polished, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. He addressed Lloyd with feigned respect, asking if he was ready. Lloyd walked to the centre of the ring, dragging his shovel along the ground. As he reached his mark, he kicked the scoop upward, caught the handle mid-air, and rested it on his shoulder. A small grin tugged at his face. He said he was ready. Ready to knock his lights out. The crowd shifted restlessly, murmurs rising as anticipation gave way to confusion. Lloyd Frontera stepped into the dueling arena, holding a shovel. At first, no one said anything. Then the whispers began. Was it some kind of bluff? A joke? But the longer they stared, the clearer it became. He was actually going to fight with it. Neumann's eye twitched as he stared at the absurd weapon in Lloyd's hands. A shovel. He clenched his jaw, visibly irritated. From the stands, Javier stood beside Lloyd's parents, arms held neatly behind his back, brow furrowed. So that's why Lloyd had asked for a solid iron shovel. He hadn't thought Lloyd actually intended to use it in the duel. At the time, it seemed like a strange request. To his left, Baron Frontera let out a horrified sigh and covered his face with one hand. His son had somehow ended up in a formal duel and was treating it like a circus act. But Javier's gaze didn't waver. This wasn't a joke, not to Lloyd. A month of relentless training, not one complaint. Days spent mentoring engineers on underfloor heating, and nights spent learning sword techniques directly from Javier. The progress had been real. Those weren't the actions of someone who took this situation lightly. Arcos called for the duel to begin. Neumann took his stance, feet set, sword steady, eyes locked on his opponent. Across from him, Lloyd shifted into position too. But whatever he was doing, it didn't look like any stance a swordsman should be taking. It was awkward, off balance, strange. Javier narrowed his eyes. That wasn't a stance. That was just standing there. Neumann dashed forward. His voice rang out, demanding to know if Lloyd was even taking this seriously. Lloyd braced himself, knees bent, shovel lowered, a flicker of focus in his eyes. Steel clashed. He parried the blow. Gasps rippled through the stands. Javier blinked. Even Arcos looked stunned. He'd actually blocked it. Neumann's brow twitched. That had to be luck. He swung again. Clang. Lloyd blocked it clean. Javier's expression shifted. His eyes widened. He wasn't imagining it. Lloyd actually looked competent out there, with a shovel. Neumann's expression tightened. His confidence wavered. Lloyd grinned. This wasn't all that unfamiliar. Back during military service, there had been bayonet drills. The stance was different, sure, but the principle wasn't far off. He lunged. The shovel shot forward like a spear. Neumann barely twisted out of the way. Lloyd adjusted his grip. The weight felt good. The scoop was wide enough to deflect a blade, and the tip was sharp enough to break roots. It wasn't just a tool, it was versatile. Then, with no warning, he jammed the shovel into the dirt, stepped on the back of the scoop, and started bouncing, like a pogo stick, cackling as he bounced in place. He waved at Neumann to come closer. From the stands, Javier stared. What was he doing? Neumann hesitated for a moment, still confused, then charged again. Lloyd dropped back to the ground, landing lightly. The grin vanished. His stance returned. Knees bent, shovel pointed forward. He was ready now. His grip was steady, his stance held, and Neumann was coming fast. Steel met iron, again and again, but this time Lloyd didn't just block, he advanced. Each strike he deflected pushed Neumann back a step, then another, and another. Neumann's eyes narrowed. He grit his teeth. This didn't make sense. Why was he being forced back? Lloyd's thoughts stayed sharp. He had his shovel, he had his training, and he had something else. A glowing panel flickered into view. Shoveling. Level 1. A passive skill. While wielding a shovel, all of his physical stats received a boost. All thanks to Javier. That 1 point had come after a grueling training session, the moment Javier finally acknowledged his effort. Then more had followed, from his parents. The first time they'd seen their son train seriously, the first time they believed he was actually trying. Each point hard-earned, each one a small step forward. It had been enough to unlock the skill, and now he was using it. Neumann couldn't believe it. He was being pushed back by Lloyd, with a shovel. He grit his teeth. Fine. If that's how it was going to be, then it was time to stop holding back. A soft glow began to rise from his body. mana wrapped around him, his sword lit faintly in his hands. From the stands, Javier's eyes narrowed. He recognised it, that flow, that stance. Neumann was channeling Mana Heart. To his left, Lloyd's father leaned forward, his expression tightening. Neumann's grip shifted. He called out to Lloyd. They were only just getting started. He burst forward, faster, sharper. A sudden blur across the arena. Javier watched, tense. To channel Mana Heart took years of focused training. There was no way a normal fighter could block that. But today, Neumann wasn't fighting a normie. Neumann closed the distance in an instant. His sword came down, aiming to cut straight through the shovel and take Lloyd's head with it. In the stands, his parents gasped. Clang! Lloyd blocked it. The blade didn't cut through, it didn't even push him back. Neumann flinched. His legs felt heavier. His grip weakened. Something was wrong. He stumbled, struggling to keep his balance. What was happening? Why did his body feel so drained? Lloyd didn't say a word, but a grin slowly crept across his face. His fourth card had just been played. The Astrahan core technique. Neumann recoiled. His eyes widened as the realization hit. Lloyd had just absorbed his mana, but Lloyd was already moving in. He stepped forward, eyes locked on target, shovel in hand. Then he swung. The shovel struck him in the side of the head. A tooth flew through the air. Neumann saw it mid-spin. He stared at it in disbelief, realizing it was his. Before he could react, the handle of the shovel caught him under the chin. His head snapped back. He staggered, struggling to stay upright. Lloyd moved in. He raised the shovel and slammed it down. The flat of the blade crashed into the back of Neumann's head, driving him face first into the dirt. Silence swept through the crowd. No one moved. No one spoke. All eyes were on the man with the shovel. The arena stayed quiet. Even Arcos was speechless, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. Then a voice rang out from somewhere in the crowd. Master Lloyd! Actually won! Others joined in. Shocked whispers turned to scattered shouting. Some in disbelief. Some in awe. Did the sword expert just lose to that scumbag? Arcos blinked hard, trying to compose himself. He cleared his throat and raised his voice. He declared it official. Lloyd Frontera had won the duel. Lloyd walked over to where Neumann lay face down in the dirt. He looked down at him. The duel might be over, but he still deserved more punishment. He raised the shovel again. Up in the stands, his father jumped to his feet, shouting that the duel was finished, but Lloyd wasn't listening. The shovel came down. Once, then again. Neumann curled into a ball, shielding his head. Lloyd kept swinging, striking him like some crazed villain. His father shouted again, louder this time, demanding that he stop. Two of the soldiers tried to restrain Lloyd. They told him the duel was over. Byron watched from the sidelines. Was Lloyd losing his mind? Javier didn't think so. Lloyd wouldn't break down like this. He was planning something again. Lloyd finally gave in. He told the soldiers he would stop. They sighed in relief and let go of him. Lloyd closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then, out of nowhere, he started hitting again. The soldiers rushed to restrain him, but Lloyd didn't give up. Javier stared. This wasn't a man driven by blind rage. Lloyd's movements were calm, deliberate. He was targeting every part of Neumann's body like he was handing out punishment. Not random, not excessive, intentional. There was something behind this. Javier thought back to a conversation they had. Lloyd had asked him to teach the Astrahan technique. That alone had been a surprise. Javier hadn't told a soul about it. He'd only been experimenting with it privately. Lloyd claimed Javier had talked about the technique in his sleep. Javier hadn't believed a word of it, and yet Lloyd had known exactly how to improve it. He'd even helped Javier perfect it, on the first try. He also told him he could beat Neumann, and he had, easily. Javier's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp voice calling out. It was Arcos. He was shouting at Lloyd to stop disgracing the knight's honour. Lloyd froze. He looked up at his father and caught his breath. Then he asked what honour he was talking about. He told Arcos to look under the tablecloth and then tell him again about this so-called honour. Arcos lifted the cloth and found a stack of letters hidden beneath it. He opened one. His eyes widened in shock. Lloyd explained. The letters were between Neumann and Tordes, the man who had swindled him in a real estate scheme. Inside were full financial records, forged documents, and details of their plan. Arcos's hands trembled as he read. The evidence was undeniable. Neumann remained on his knees, staring in silent shock. Those documents were supposed to be hidden. How had they ended up here? Lloyd looked at him. He knew exactly what Neumann was thinking. How did he find them? The answer was simple. In the novel, Javier eventually discovered the hiding spot. So Lloyd had sent Podong to retrieve them the night before. Arcos slumped into his chair, still in disbelief. A cold stare settled on his face. Lloyd thought his father was too kind. Another leader would be demanding Neumann's head right now. His father was a good man. But good men don't always make the best leaders. Lloyd spoke up. He turned to his father and asked if he could suggest a punishment. Arcos said he was listening. Lloyd proposed they drop a mouse on Neumann's head. If he's hurt, exile him. If not, just demote him. The crowd stirred. What kind of punishment was that? Who gets hurt by a mouse? Arcos wondered if Lloyd was going easy on him, hoping he might reflect and repent. Bayern remarked he was glad they were giving Neumann a chance to change. Arcos agreed. Lloyd could proceed as suggested. He asked if Neumann had any objections. Neumann agreed. He thanked the Lord for his mercy. Lloyd looked at the man. If you go too easy on criminals, would they really change? Not a chance. They'd just take it as weakness and try again, knowing the consequences wouldn't be that bad. And sure enough, Neumann was already grinning. He was certain the Baron would regret this. That he'd get his revenge. That he'd deal with the son too. Lloyd told him he must be happy, smiling like that. But not to worry. This would be the last time. Neumann looked up at him unnerved. What did he mean by that? Lloyd glanced at Podong on his shoulder and handed him a red seed. He told Neumann he'd find out soon enough. Then he tossed Podong into the air. Lloyd glared at him. He wasn't letting him off that easy. A flash of light burst overhead. Podong began to grow. The tiny creature expanded into a towering beast 30 feet tall. The crowd gasped as Lloyd ran for cover. Neumann remained frozen, staring up at the giant hamster as it fell toward him. A cloud of dust exploded behind Lloyd in the place where Neumann had been. Lloyd glanced back at the impact site. A crater now marked the spot, with Podong lying flat at the centre of it. "What a shame," he said. "Looks like it's exile then." He smirked. "And that's how you take out the trash." Sometime later, out in the village, Podong was cheerfully digging a long trench that stretched straight through the heart of the village. His powerful limbs tore through the ground with ease, leaving a clean path behind him. Lloyd and Javier stood off to the side, quietly watching the giant hamster work. Javier turned to Lloyd and asked what Sir Podong was doing. Lloyd explained that he was carving out a road for the village. He looked satisfied. Things were finally turning around. The soldiers who had once lounged around like freeloaders now moved like real construction workers, focused, sweating, and strong from the labour. He thought back to an ancient city he had read about in his old life. Rome. A place known for its vast network of roads. One of the most famous was called the Appian Way, and the method they used to build it was the same method he planned to use here. The road would begin at the manor and end at the base of the eastern mountain. Javier asked why he was building a road. Lloyd told him to wait and see. With a grin on his face, he said he was going to put this land on the map, and walked away with his shovel resting on his shoulder. Javier stopped him with a question. Where had he gained the knowledge to do all this? First the heated floors, then a giant hamster, and now a road? His expression grew serious. Then he asked if Lloyd was really Lloyd Frontera. The system chimed, warning Lloyd that Javier was becoming suspicious of his identity. Lloyd stared at him. If Javier thought he had stolen Lloyd Frontera's body, would he cut him down? Probably would. Lloyd took a breath and reminded himself. He had a plan for this exact moment. His eyes narrowed as he glared at Javier, looking deliberately obnoxious. He said he'd been studying while no one was looking. Was that not allowed? The system chimed again. Special skill activated. Stubborn insistence has been triggered. Javier sighed. From what he'd seen, all Lloyd did when no one was looking was drink. Lloyd fired back. Had Javier been watching him 24 hours a day? Of course not. He could be reading before bed. Or even while taking a dump. Javier had no idea what he did with all his time. Javier asked him to explain the giant hamster. Even a skilled mage with 20 years of training would struggle with summoning magic like that. Lloyd fired back. Look at Javier himself. How could a guy in his 20s be that good at using his mana core without a teacher? Was he a genius or something? Javier started to respond, but Lloyd cut him off. If Javier could be a genius, why couldn't he? Maybe he was just born with a gift for summoning. Javier had no response. He was completely defeated. Lloyd picked up his shovel and rested it on his shoulder as he turned to leave. If that was all, he said, he had to get back to work. As he walked away, he wondered if Javier had believed any of what he just told him. He spotted Sabayan overseeing the workers and asked him to take over while he stepped away. Bayan nodded and said he'd handle it. Javier followed behind and asked if he could accompany him, since it was his duty to watch over him. Lloyd replied that of course he could. What a silly question. Javier then asked where they were going. Lloyd told him the destination was a fair distance away, but he had to go. There was money that had been stolen from the land, and he intended to get it back. We moved to a small border town named Ludinia. Inside a dimly lit room at a local inn, a man slammed his fist on the table. It was Tordes, and he was furious. How could they have lost so much money? Were they cheated? A second man stood nearby, calm and unimpressed. He told him that's how gambling worked. You win some, you lose some. Then he added, if Tordes couldn't pay for his protection anymore, he'd be taking his leave. A flash of panic crossed Tordes' face. He told the man he could get the money, he just needed more time. He couldn't leave him like this. The bodyguard gave a cold shrug. He said he'd stay, for now. But the moment the money stopped, he'd be gone. Tordes slumped forward, resting his head on his hand. He just needed to lie low for a while. Word was, someone was already looking for him. If he stayed quiet, maybe they'd give up. Then he could find another easy mark and earn it all back. A sudden bang shook the room as the door burst open with a violent kick. Lloyd stepped inside. His tone was casual as he said it sounded like they were talking about him. Tordes jumped to his feet, demanding to know who he was. Lloyd paused, then smiled. Of course, they didn't even know what he looked like. He grinned wider, then said his name clearly. Lloyd Frontera. Sound familiar? Tordes froze, his mouth hanging open in shock. The bodyguard stepped forward and asked if he should kill him. Tordes snapped out of it, panicking. He told the man they had to run, now. The bodyguard grabbed Tordes and crouched low. Energy gathered at his feet, air swirling around him like a small vortex. With a blast of wind, he launched them through the window. Tordes clutched under one arm. They landed smoothly outside, the air softening the impact. Then he looked up and saw someone standing in their path. Javier. Sword raised, steady at his shoulder. He stepped forward and drew a clean line through the air with his blade, calm but ready. He told the bodyguard to leave Tordes behind and walk away. If he didn't, he'd be treated as an accomplice. Javier watched them closely. Lloyd had been right. They tried to escape through the back window. The bodyguard scoffed. He looked Javier up and down and asked if he was even old enough to know how to use that sword he was holding. He raised his hand and a crimson sphere of energy began to form in his palm. Watching from the broken window above, Lloyd remembered how it played out in the novel. After his master's death, Javier had hunted these two down. This was where he first fought a dark enchanter. He'd struggled then. Gravitational magic had nearly overwhelmed him. Lloyd smiled to himself. In the novel, that is. This time was different. The bodyguard fired the crimson blast straight at Javier. Javier raised his sword to block, but the moment it made contact, the orb expanded, swelling outward into a glowing sphere that swallowed him whole. Pressure hit him instantly. The gravitational magic forced him down, grinding his feet into the dirt, but he held firm. His stance tightened. He didn't fold under the weight, not this time. From the window, Lloyd watched. In the novel, Javier had been just a high-level swordsman, but now his mana core was stronger. Javier let out a breath, then slashed outward with his sword. The energy surrounding him split open on contact and dissipated instantly. Javier looked up, surprised. He'd never seen magic like that before, but it hadn't stopped him. The bodyguard stood frozen, not understanding what had just happened. Then he backed off, eyes narrowing. He knew he was no match for this. Without another word, he launched himself into the air, leaving Tordes behind. As he flew, he shouted that their contract was over. Javier stepped toward Tordes, sword still in hand. He told him he was in serious trouble. Committing fraud against a noble family was a grave crime. Tordes backed away, stumbling until he fell to the ground. He tried to scramble back, but Javier kept advancing. He told Tordes he'd cut off both his legs and make him crawl to the courthouse. He raised his sword high. Tordes screamed. Then a voice cut in, sharp and firm. Lloyd. He stepped between them, arms outstretched, shielding Tordes with his body. He told Javier to calm down. If he went through with it, they'd chop his head off in court. Javier froze, staring at Lloyd in disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Lloyd was actually thinking of someone other than himself. Back in Tordes' room at the inn, he sat tied to a chair, trembling. Across from him, Lloyd leaned back casually, smiling. He told Tordes not to worry. Everyone got a little greedy sometimes. And honestly, chopping off someone's head over a bit of thievery felt a little harsh. Tordes stammered. So, he was forgiven? Lloyd let out a light laugh. Of course. They weren't taking him to court. He must be grateful, right? Grateful enough to hand over the rest of the Baron's assets. Tordes nodded quickly, stuttering as he said he'd gladly do it, if that meant everything would be forgiven. Lloyd smiled again, eyes sharp. That was the bare minimum. They were only just getting started. Lloyd's smile didn't fade. If Tordes wanted forgiveness, he'd have to do more. Tordes swallowed hard and asked what he needed to do. Whatever it was, he'd obey. Lloyd slid a sheet of paper across the table. Just a simple contract, he said. Everything would be settled once he signed it. Tordes looked down. What kind of contract was this? Lloyd told him it was an employment contract, with a salary, of course. He grinned and added that he'd be keeping 80% of that salary to pay back the debt. Tordes looked crushed, but he didn't argue. Lloyd told him not to worry, he could pay off the debt in full. In, say, 500 years. Tordes stared at him, stunned. Across the room, Javier looked just as stunned. He hadn't expected Lloyd to forgive him so easily, but this? Lloyd grinned again. There was no way he'd kill someone who owed his family that much money. That would be a waste. He'd bleed him dry for the rest of his life. Tordes muttered that he'd never seen such an unjust contract. Lloyd blinked at him, wide-eyed, like the deal made perfect sense. He said Tordes didn't have to sign. The smile dropped, replaced with a cold, threatening stare. They could always take it to court instead. He grabbed the pen and signed without a second thought. He knew they'd have his head if he didn't. The following day, Lloyd, Javier, and Tordes set off in a wagon headed back toward the Frontera barony. As they rolled down the worn path, Javier spoke up. He told Lloyd they'd managed to recover enough money to hold off loan payments for the next few months. Lloyd nodded but said he had no intention of sitting on that money. 30 soldiers weren't enough. He needed to hire more men. But that brought another problem to mind. How was he supposed to convince anyone to work for him with the terrible reputation he had? A few days later, back at the Frontera barony, Lloyd has set up a notice advertising new job openings. A line has already formed, and at the front sits Lloyd at a desk, looking genuinely confused. He turns to Javier and asks why there are so many applicants. Don't the people despise him? Javier responds, they did, but not anymore. Lloyd has proven himself. He delivered the heated floors on time, dealt with a traitor, and can even perform impressive summoning magic. Now people see him as a trustworthy, capable man. Lloyd blinks, stunned. He didn't expect this. At the front of the line, a man politely calls out to get Lloyd's attention. Lloyd snaps out of his thoughts and gestures for him to sign the contract. But before doing so, the man insists on expressing his gratitude. He explains that his child used to catch severe colds whenever the weather turned harsh. But this year, thanks to the heated homes, they haven't had to worry. His smile beams with relief. He bows deeply, full of gratitude and respect. Lloyd freezes, unsure how to react. This has never happened before. He stutters, barely getting the words out, telling the man he's glad for him and his family. But in the back of his mind, he's uneasy. All he'd wanted was enough coin to keep the barony afloat. Sitting here now, he feels a little embarrassed. Before signing, the man mentions something else. He explains that he has a relative in a neighbouring territory who heard about the heated floors, and wants one too. He asks if it's possible to order one on their behalf. Lloyd's mind starts racing. Finally, the moment he's been waiting for. A grin spreads across his face, eyes glinting with opportunity. Of course, he says, it's no problem at all. But he'll have to charge extra for travel. Javier, standing nearby, watches him with an unimpressed look. That scheming expression he knows too well. He wonders if this has all been part of Lloyd's long-term plan. But something else keeps nagging at him. Why is Lloyd building that road? Later, Lloyd and Javier stand on a hill overlooking the village. In the distance, the mountains stretch wide. Lloyd points toward them and says, those mountains will be stripped soon enough. Javier turns to him confused. What does he mean? Lloyd explains that the heating system he designed needs fuel, and wood won't be enough in the long run. There's a flicker of concern in Javier's eyes. If Lloyd knew that, then why build so many in the first place? Lloyd tells him that's why he's building the road. At the end of it lies a coal mine. His face twists into that greedy grin Javier knows all too well. They'll sell the coal at a huge markup. The people have heated floors now, there's no going back. But of course, he'll give the locals a small discount. Javier scowls, his face full of disgust. Lloyd is as devious as ever. Lloyd glances at Javier and asks if he thinks he's being a scumbag again. Does he really believe they can repay their debts without taking advantage of the mines? Javier doesn't respond right away. He looks out toward the mountains, thinking it over. He admits that, for now, this might be the only way to keep the barony afloat. But then he adds, others have tried to mine that place before. The rock is unstable. It always collapses. Lloyd waves him off without worry. He already knows that. That's why he's going to use a secret technique to handle it. The shield tunnelling method. He raises his shovel high over his head and declares they've got no time to waste. There's still a mountain to break. Javier watches him walk off with a spring in his step, wondering where on earth he learns these things. But for now, he'll trust him. His lord has a plan. That's enough. Far from the village near the base of the mountain, the entrance to the coal mine lies in ruins, collapsed under broken beams and fallen rock. But deep inside the darkness, something stirs. A set of large antennae twitches. Glowing red eyes pierce through the black. An entire colony of giant ants crawls just beneath the surface, lurking, waiting. They wait below, unseen, but for how long? The sky split with light. A glowing pentagram spun to life in front of Lloyd as he clapped his hands together, eyes sharp with focus. Magic surged around him, pure, theatrical, and over the top. He thrust the circle upward. A blinding beam of green energy blasted into the heavens, tearing through clouds like a divine announcement. He raised his voice, declaring the one thing any self-respecting man in his position would ask for. A luxury Gangnam apartment. The light twinkled like a distant star. Then, crash. It slammed back down, striking the ground in a glorious burst of magic. Stone and steel spiralled upward as an ultra-modern high-rise apartment shimmered into existence. Lloyd stood at its base, one arm still in the air like a magician at the end of his final trick. Then, his hand slowly lowered. Lloyd sat at his desk, daydreaming, head resting on one hand, the other drawing a schematic with his finger. Energy flickered from his fingertip, cutting across the paper like a laser. He thought to himself that this was taking forever. He wished he could just summon 100 undead workers so he wouldn't have to pay them. No salaries, no complaints, just obedient labour that didn't need breaks. A notification chimed, the system reminding him that if he didn't like his new skill, he could just use a pencil. But Lloyd wasn't about to give it up. As far as he was concerned, the skill was perfect. Thanks to all the points he'd gained from recent events, he had managed to level up a lot of his skills. Things were finally starting to come together. He now stood in front of the mines. The entrance was sealed by a collapsed wall of stone and dirt, a jagged mess from the last disaster. Lloyd stared at it in silence, piecing together his next move. His eyes began to glow faintly green as he activated his surveying skill. The rubble dissolved away in his vision, replaced by transparent layers of the terrain. He could see 5 meters in, just enough to start mapping out a safe path forward. Once the scan ended, he lowered his hand and pressed his fingers to his chin, deep in thought. It wouldn't be enough to rely on brute strength for this. Not with how unstable everything was. And Padong was still exhausted from all the long-distance jobs they'd been pulling lately. There had to be another way. He paused, then remembered the summoning game. He'd been hoarding RP for a while now, no reason not to use it. A few minutes later, the summoning game was active. Lloyd sat cross-legged in front of a small glowing circle, waiting patiently. The magic pulsed gently across the floor, steady and soft. Something was coming. The surface rippled. A head poked through, round, smiling, and topped with a tiny decorative bow. Whatever it was, it looked absolutely delighted to be here. It slipped through the circle and flopped face first onto the ground with a soft thud. Lloyd stared. The creature looked like some kind of snake, small, round-bodied, and almost too cheerful. It lifted its head and beamed at him, clearly thrilled to see him. At first glance, it looked completely useless, but he'd learned not to trust appearances. He asked if it could grow with seeds like podong. It nodded. Then he asked if it had a special skill. Another enthusiastic nod. That was enough to catch his interest. He smiled, curious now, and asked it to show him. The creature's face lit up with excitement. A few weeks later, the mine was fully operational. The collapsed entrance had been cleared, supports were in place, and the tunnel stretched steadily into the earth, stable, reinforced, and expanding deeper by the day. At the front of the operation was Bangul. No longer the tiny creature that had flopped out of the summoning circle, she now worked inside a large protective cylinder, Lloyd's custom-designed shield tunnelling device. Nestled comfortably within, she chewed through rock and dirt with tireless enthusiasm. Her skill, chomping dirt. The cylinder advanced as she dug, leaving behind a smooth circular tunnel. Lloyd followed close behind, coated in sweat and dust, barking instructions as he moved. He glanced back and called for Javier to get into position. Javier stepped forward, sword drawn, standing directly behind the moving cylinder. Bangle's tail gave a distinct shake. A moment later, her second skill activated. Steel dung. Red-hot metal rods launched straight from Bangul's rear, fired cleanly out of her body and directly toward Javier. He was already in position, sword raised. With smooth, practiced motion, he cut through the rods mid-air, slicing them into smaller, manageable chunks. The glowing fragments scattered across the tunnel floor, still radiating heat. Those fragments were later cooled and collected by the blacksmiths, then reforged into steel supports to line the tunnel walls. Javier let out a quiet breath, eyes half-lidded with the dull weight of acceptance. This was his life now. He'd trained for years with a sword, dreaming of glory, of battlefield valour, of knighthood in shining armour. And yet, here he was, in a mine, deep underground, swinging a blade at molten excrement launched from the backside of a snake. Lloyd called out to the workers, instructing them to move the support rig forward so Bangul could keep digging. He wiped the sweat from his brow, the stifling heat and thinning air pressing heavily on him. The ventilation pipe he'd installed was working well, keeping fresh air flowing through the tunnel. Javier told him to go back to the surface and rest, but Lloyd stayed. He was the one in charge. He had to be here. Back in Korea, the bosses never came down to the site. They gave orders from a distance and stayed clean while others got dirty. Lloyd had sworn he'd be different. He activated his surveying skill and scanned the tunnel ahead. Coal. He raised his shovel high and signalled to the crew. They were close. The men shouted back, energised, shovels raised high. Lloyd gave Bangul, perched on his shoulder, a pat. Without her, progress would have been much slower. He turned to the workers and laid out the next phase. Once they reached the coal, they'd dismantle the shield and expand the tunnel for full-scale excavation. But before he could finish, a deep, cracking thud echoed from the far wall. The noise rang out again, louder this time. A low, grinding groan of shifting stone, followed by the sharp crack of something splitting under pressure. Lloyd turned toward the source. The wall of solid rock at the far end of the tunnel trembled, then cracked. He narrowed his eyes and activated his surveying skill, the green glow flickering across his pupils. The scan pierced through the wall, revealing the problem before it surfaced. Something was hollowing out the stone from the other side. A gap growing steadily. The wall gave way all at once. It burst apart with a thunderous crash, sending shards of stone across the tunnel. A giant ant surged through the breach, chitinous jaws snapping open as it lunged straight for Lloyd. He stumbled back, barely dodging the bite as the creature's mandibles slammed shut with a metallic clang. Javier moved fast. He shot forward and slashed at the ant's face, slicing clean through its jaws. The mandibles hit the ground with a wet clang, severed completely. The ant shrieked, rearing back in pain. Lloyd jumped up and charged, swinging the flat of his shovel like a mallet. He slammed it down on the ant's head, driving it into the tunnel floor with a heavy crack. The creature collapsed, twitching once before going still. He stood over the corpse, chest heaving, heart racing. That had been too close, and none of it matched what he remembered. This wasn't in the book. Then the thought hit him. Ants lived in colonies. He turned toward the gaping hole in the wall. From the darkness beyond, dozens of red eyes shimmered. They began to move. A wave of ants surged into the tunnel. Lloyd shouted for the workers to retreat. Javier was already cutting them down. Blade flashing as each strike severed another limb, another head, but there were too many. Lloyd joined him, swinging his shovel into the crowd, but they just kept coming. If even a handful made it to the surface, the barony would be overrun. They needed to stop them here. Lloyd was thinking, going over his options, trying to figure out what would work. He didn't say anything, just stood there, focused. Then Javier slapped him across the face. Lloyd staggered a step back, stunned for a moment, before narrowing his eyes at him. Javier told him to stop panicking and get a grip. Lloyd scowled. He wasn't panicking. He was trying to come up with a plan. Javier didn't argue. He just told him to hurry. Lloyd's eyes darted around. Then it clicked. There was a way. He grabbed a lit torch and turned to Javier. They were going into the nest. Javier, still fending off the swarm, stared at him like he'd lost his mind. It sounded like suicide. But Lloyd was already moving. Javier grit his teeth. If Lloyd had a plan, he had no choice but to follow it. They pushed forward, straight toward the oncoming horde. We returned to the Frontera Manor. Arcos is frozen in place, stunned by the news from the mines. He demands to know, is Lloyd still alive? The messenger nods grimly. Lloyd had ordered all the workers to evacuate. staying behind with Javier so the others could escape. Without another word, Arcos grabs his armor and sword. He tells the man they're going to get Lloyd, now. Back in the mines, Lloyd and Javier stood back to back, swarmed by ants on every side. Javier shouted something over the chaos, but Lloyd didn't answer. He was too focused. His eyes scanned the stone around them, searching. They weren't leaving the tunnels. That was good. But they were surrounded. Javier wouldn't last much longer. The air was thin, dangerously so, even for him. A faint glow pulsed from Lloyd's eyes as he activated his detection skill. He needed to find it. There had to be methane-producing bacteria nearby. If he could locate a gas pocket, he could blow this entire colony sky high. Suddenly, he called out, motioning for Javier to move forward. He was sure something had to be close. His eyes locked onto a layer just beneath the stone. There it was. He stepped forward and began digging with his shovel as fast as he could. An ant lunged toward him. Javier twisted and cut it down in a single stroke. Lloyd didn't stop. He kept digging. Then a piercing shriek tore through the tunnel. Both men grimaced, clutching their ears as the sound echoed through the stone. Something enormous began to approach, its footsteps booming with every stride. Towering 30 feet tall, the queen emerged from the far end of the tunnel. Her armoured limbs scraped against the walls as she moved, her mandibles twitching. Lloyd stared up at her. Then he turned toward Javier, silently asking if he could hold the queen back. Javier gave a flat no. Lloyd looked at him, questioning how he could know without trying. Javier told him there were some things you just knew. He stepped forward anyway, drawing his sword. He didn't really have much of a choice. The queen lunged. Javier met her charge head-on, his blade clashing with her armoured limbs. He planted his feet and forced her to a halt, holding back the massive creature with everything he had. The queen hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance. Javier used the opening to twist his blade and strike, managing to knock her back slightly. Lloyd kept digging. The gas pocket had to be close. Every second Javier bought was a second closer to finishing this. The queen attacked again. Sparks lit the tunnel as sword met claw. Javier shifted, blocked, and parried. The exchange of blows was sharp and fast, each one louder than the last. The force behind them would have crushed someone else by now, but Javier held. Then Lloyd felt it. A sudden change in the air pressure. The gas had broken through. He signalled the retreat. Javier broke off and fell in beside him. The queen shrieked and surged forward, the sound of her massive limbs crashing through the tunnel growing louder with every step. They ran. Up ahead, the walls of the tunnel narrowed, just enough to give them a chance. They sprinted for it and dove through. As they jumped, Lloyd twisted in mid-air and hurled the torch behind them. It struck the queen, bounced off her carapace, and landed behind her, clattering to the stone floor. The queen rushed forward, but the narrow passage stopped her in place. Only her head fit through. Then fire erupted. The explosion tore through the tunnel. Flames surged forward, consuming the queen from behind. The blast struck her body, and then the shockwave slammed into the narrow space. Javier didn't hesitate. He threw himself over Lloyd, shielding him with his own body. The shockwave blasted through the tunnel behind the queen. Heat followed, but the flames stayed trapped on the other side. Smoke flooded the space, followed by falling debris and choking dust. A large chunk of rock broke loose from the ceiling and struck Javier on the head. The light dimmed. Then everything went still. Outside the mine, the ground trembled. Dust kicked up from the entrance as a deep, muffled explosion sounded from within. Arcos froze for a moment, then bolted toward the entrance. Bayan caught him by the arm and held him back. The blast had weakened the structure. The entrance was unstable. Going in now would be suicide. Arcos fought to break free, shouting, but Bayan didn't let go. The earth groaned in the distance. They could only stand there, waiting, watching the dust settle and praying someone would come out. Underground, Everything was still. Lloyd's ears rang. His body was pinned beneath weight he immediately recognized. Javier. He opened his eyes and coughed. The air was thick with dust. Pushing Javier off, he slowly sat up. His head throbbed. His vision was blurry. The Queen's body was slumped in the narrow tunnel behind them, blackened and still. Nothing moved. The explosion had worked. Javier lay beside him, breathing but unconscious. Lloyd glanced at him, remembering how he'd thrown himself over him at the last second. Bangul was close, lying on her side. Lloyd picked her up carefully. Her small body rose and fell with shallow breaths. He held her close and whispered an apology. This had all been his fault. Then he looked ahead and stopped. The tunnel had collapsed. The exit was buried beneath a solid wall of rock. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. A system alert flashed into view. Warning. Oxygen levels critical. He activated his surveying skill. He couldn't see the other side. He adjusted his grip on the shovel and started digging. The shovel hit stone again and again. Behind him, Javier stirred. His eyes opened, barely. Everything was blurred. Through the haze, he saw Lloyd, still moving, still fighting to get them out. Then he passed out. A system message appeared noting that Javier had been moved by Lloyd's determination. The approval rating rose by 6. Lloyd gained 108 RP. Lloyd didn't pause. He asked the system to scan for skills, anything that could help. The system scanned Lloyd. Multiple skills were detected: mana absorption, mana processing, and mana amplification. A prompt appeared, informing him that these skills could now be combined into a single unified technique, one that closely resembled the legendary Azrahan core technique. Lloyd grinned. He clenched his fist, adrenaline still lingering in his veins, and hissed out a satisfied yes. He'd been practicing that technique relentlessly, even after the duel. Now finally, he had a chance to take it to the next level. He pressed the confirmation without hesitation. A glow of energy pulsed around him, swirling before diving into his chest. The warmth focused in his heart, where a shimmering mana circle formed and locked into place. Skill fusion successful, the system announced. Mana amplification increased to 120%. It wasn't quite the creation of a mana heart, but the technique was solid. And with the RP system, Lloyd could keep leveling it up in no time. Lloyd tapped the upgrade button again and again, burning through his points until the technique reached level 10. Another system message appeared. Azrahan core technique evolved. Current form, double circle. Mana amplification increased to 200%. He checked the next upgrade cost, 100 RP. He only had 7 left. Still, it was progress. Earlier, he'd also levelled up his surveying and design skills. That process had unlocked 2 unexpected perks. Energizer. Move without experiencing fatigue for 10 minutes. 1 use per day. Latent power surge, triple mana amplification for 20 seconds. 1 use per day. Lloyd gripped his shovel, eyes burning with renewed energy. Time to put it all to use. He activated Energizer. A jolt of power rippled through his body. Energy crackled across his limbs like a sudden rush of adrenaline. Without waiting, he lunged forward and began digging at full speed. Each strike of the shovel rang out as he tore through the rocky soil. The air was thinning. His lungs strained with every breath, but he didn't stop. Using surveying, he scanned ahead through the rock, eyes darting for any sign of an opening. He kept going, digging, swinging, clawing at the earth with relentless speed. The oxygen was almost gone. Then he froze. A glimmer of hope. A small hole in the stone just up ahead. His eyes widened. Was that the entrance? He threw his strength into every motion, his body screaming in protest. The rock split faster now. He was close. The gap ahead was growing. He had to be nearly there. But then his body buckled. He dropped to his knees. The The shovel slipped from his grasp. Energizer had worn off. The 10-minute time limit was up. He stayed still for a second, panting, the tunnel spinning around him. Then he activated latent power surge. Mana burst through his veins. His body jolted back into motion. He lunged forward again, digging like a madman. He had 20 seconds. The opening ahead widened further, but the oxygen was gone. His vision blurred. He collapsed. Laying flat on the cold tunnel floor, he couldn't even lift his head. All I wanted was a cushy life, he thought dimly. As his eyes began to close, a low rumble echoed from ahead. He blinked, barely conscious. The wall in front of him trembled. And then it crumbled. Podong burst through head first, beaming with his usual carefree smile. Air rushed into the tunnel. Lloyd grinned weakly. He could breathe again. He reached for his shovel, used it to brace himself, and pushed to his feet. The dream of a cushy life wasn't over yet. Near the mine entrance, Arcos, Bayan, and a handful of men moved carefully through the tunnel, their torches casting flickering firelight across the unstable walls. The air was thin. Dust clung to every breath. Bayan spoke up, warning that it was too dangerous to go any deeper. Arcos didn't hesitate. He told Bayan to take the men and head back. He was determined to find his son, no matter how deep he had to go. But before Bayan could respond, Arcos stopped in his tracks. His eyes narrowed. Someone was approaching. A lone figure emerged from the darkness ahead. It was Lloyd, covered in dust, unsteady on his feet, with Javier slung over his back. The system chimed softly. By overcoming your physical limitations in an extreme environment, your Astrahan core technique has strengthened. New skill unlocked, power saving mode. When completely exhausted, you can still activate the core technique in a weakened state. Arcos rushed forward. Lloyd looked up at his father and collapsed at his feet. He'd made it out. Now he could leave the rest to his father. The next day, in the village, morning light spilled over the rooftops as people gathered in small groups, talking in low voices. 2 men stood outside, one stacking crates on the ground, the other leaning on a sweeping brush. They shook their heads as they talked. Like most of the village, they'd assumed Lloyd was just a spoiled drunk, the kind of man who'd never lifted a finger in his life. But clearly, they'd been wrong. He'd stayed behind to hold off the giant ants, giving the miners a chance to escape, and somehow he'd won. He'd carried Javier out on his back. One by one, the villagers began to see him differently, not just as the useless heir to a noble house, but as someone who had stepped up when it mattered. The murmurs became talk. The talk became chatter. By midday, Lloyd's name was on everyone's lips, not in mockery, but in recognition. Back at the manor, Lloyd was still passed out in bed. The room was quiet, sunlight spilling faintly through the curtains. Javier sat nearby with his arms crossed, keeping silent watch from a chair by the bedside. He hadn't moved in a while, but his eyes never left Lloyd. Then, Lloyd's eyes twitched. They opened slowly. Javier noticed at once. His posture eased, and a quiet breath left him. Finally, Lloyd was awake. The system chimed. Your recent actions have left a strong impression. The people are talking. Your reputation has shifted dramatically. Lloyd blinked at the screen hovering in front of him, still processing. For the achievement of turning around your public image, you have been awarded 500 RP. He lay there for a moment, expression unreadable. A grin tugged at his lips, wide and shameless. He didn't care about being a hero, but look at all that sweet RP. Two weeks later, the mine was alive again with the sound of pickaxes and voices. The workers were back, repairing the damaged tunnels, restoring supports, and digging deeper into the earth. A few men paused mid-swing, eyes widening in surprise. Lloyd and Javier had returned. The moment they stepped into view, several workers approached, bowing low in gratitude. They thanked Lloyd over and over for everything he had done. He'd risked his life for them. Lloyd wasn't sure how to react. He wasn't used to being welcomed, let alone appreciated. As he passed through the camp, the miners watched him with awe. He wasn't like the other nobles. He'd risked his life for them. He noticed their stares and shifted uncomfortably. The mine, at least, was running smoothly now. 2 weeks of hard work had made it safe again, or at least it seemed that way. But Lloyd wasn't about to take any chances. Not even a small hazard could be ignored. Javier followed close behind, eyeing the path ahead. After a while, he finally asked why they were heading into the old ant tunnels again. He reminded Lloyd that someone of his status shouldn't be risking his life crawling around underground. This was work the miners could handle. Then Javier hesitated. Was Lloyd actually concerned about their safety? Lloyd stopped and called him a fool. Without looking back, he muttered that the more risk he took, the bigger share he could demand from the profits. Javier blinked. He still couldn't tell. Was Lloyd a hero or a villain? The system chimed in. Javier's approval rating had nearly increased, but didn't. Eventually they reached the far end of the tunnel. Javier gestured for them to turn back, but Lloyd raised a hand. He was using his survey skill. Behind the wall, something. A hollow space. Ignoring Javier's protests, Lloyd began digging. Javier tried to stop him, asking if they really wanted to know what was sealed away behind solid rock. Lloyd reminded him, if there were ant eggs, this whole nightmare could start all over again. He broke through. Behind the wall was a hidden chamber, and inside it, a massive green-skinned figure, an orc. Muscular and half-naked, suspended from the ceiling in silk bindings, unconscious. His hands and legs were tied tight. Around his feet lay the limp bodies of livestock, clearly food the ants had stored. Javier immediately reached for his sword, but Lloyd grabbed his shoulder, stopping him. He told Javier he was being too reckless, as usual. Then, still keeping his eyes on the orc, he asked what kind of creature it was. Javier shot him a look. It was obviously an orc. Wasn't that common knowledge? Lloyd then asked if it was dead. Javier said he doubted it. He'd heard stories. Giant ants paralyze their prey and store them for later. Lloyd grinned to himself. What an amazing find. Back at the manor. The orc was now awake, sitting on the edge of a guest room bed that looked like it might collapse under him at any moment. He introduced himself as Arosh, son of the Sand and Steel tribe, and every few sentences, he oinked. He thanked Lloyd for saving his life, oink, and swore he wouldn't forget the debt. Lloyd's brow furrowed. He asked if Arosh was saying oink on purpose, maybe to make himself stand out. Arosh looked completely serious. He said he had no idea what Lloyd was talking about. Oink. Then, puffing out his chest, he declared that Arosh, of the Sand and Steel tribe, would never forget Lloyd's act of kindness. If there was anything Lloyd desired, anything at all, he need only ask. Lloyd leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting into a grin. The kind of grin that suggested gears were turning in his head. He said he wanted 120 orcs to work in the mine. Arosh's face froze. He said that would be impossible. Lloyd's grin flickered. He clicked his tongue, annoyed, but just as quickly the smile returned. He asked why not. Arosh studied him for a moment, then said he had looked just like a bad man there for a second. Lloyd told him he was mistaken. Arosh went on to explain that orcs from their tribe were warriors, and warriors only followed other warriors. Lloyd wasn't one, so they wouldn't take orders from him. Lloyd fell silent, sinking into thought. Then it clicked. He remembered something. Wild orcs came of age by bringing back the head of a giant ant. Arosh must have been trying to complete that rite when he got captured. A new idea began to form. He started licking his lips in excitement, disgustingly so, then broke into a wide grin. Clapping his hands, he swayed slightly in his seat and gave a cheerful sigh. He said that was that then. A shame, really. Then he turned to Arosh and congratulated him, said he'd done it. He completed his coming-of-age trial. Arosh looked down, ashamed. He said Lloyd was wrong. He had failed. Lloyd looked at him with mock surprise. He asked what he was talking about. Hadn't they slain the queen ant together? Arosh hesitated. He didn't remember that. Lloyd told him he must have lost part of his memory during the fight. It had been incredible, he said. The queen ant quivered at the sight of Arosh. He did most of the work. Lloyd only delivered the final blow. Javier, who had been silently watching from across the room, looked like he might gag. His face twisted in open disgust. Lloyd was manipulating the poor orc, and he wasn't even trying to hide it. Lloyd stood and walked behind Arosh, placing both hands firmly on his shoulders. Calmly, he looked forward and spoke as if reliving the moment alongside him. He said yes, they had slain the queen together. He lifted his chin and gently guided Arosh to look ahead too, as if the memory were playing out before them. Then he asked if Arosh, the great warrior, could persuade his tribe's leader to send 120 orcs to the mine. Arosh repeated the phrase slowly, the great warrior. He clenched his fists, then roared that Lloyd would have his orcs. A week later, Lloyd and Arosh arrived at the village of the Sand and Steel tribe. Inside the chief's tent, Lloyd knelt before the tribe's leader. The air was hot and thick, with only the smell of sweat and earth lingering around them. The chief sat on a throne draped in a massive animal pelt, his arms resting on the carved stone sides. Broad-shouldered and stern, he spoke with authority as he solemnly apologized. He could not grant Lloyd's request. Lloyd blinked in confusion. He stood up from his kneeling position and asked why the great chief was unable to fulfill it. The chief explained that their tribe ate an enormous amount of meat to maintain their strength. They hunted every single day in 3 separate shifts just to keep up. If they were to leave for the mines, they would suffer muscle loss. That could not be permitted. Lloyd tilted his head. Every day? The chief nodded. Meat spoiled quickly. There was no way to store it for long, so they had to hunt constantly to ensure a steady supply and keep their bodies in peak condition. Lloyd rubbed his chin. It really was all about muscle with these people. From the side, Javier muttered that Lloyd should just give up, but Lloyd didn't move. He cupped his chin, deep in thought. Then he looked back at the chief. What if the meat didn't spoil? What if it could last several days without going bad? Would that change anything? The chief paused, then nodded, oinking as he spoke. If such a thing were possible, he said, they could reduce their hunting and assist at the mine. They simply could not risk muscle loss, but they would gladly repay Lloyd if his solution worked. Lloyd grinned. He said it just might be possible. With a wide smile, he declared that he could make the meat last longer. When Lloyd first arrived at the village, he witnessed a sight he wouldn't forget. Arosh and the tribe's chief, his father, locked eyes across the village square. Tears welled up as they called out to each other's names. Then, without hesitation, both of them broke into a full sprint. They crashed together in a thunderous hug, the impact sending a wave of air rippling outward. The blast was strong enough to nearly knock Lloyd and his men off their feet. Lloyd watched with a grin. If he could get 120 workers with that kind of strength, productivity would go through the roof. After the emotional reunion, Arosh stepped forward and presented the severed head of the queen ant. The moment the tribe saw it, they erupted in cheers, fists raised in triumph. To celebrate, they declared a grueling leg day. Without missing a beat, dozens of orcs dropped into squats and lunges, some lifting massive slabs of metal, others using glittering treasure as weights. Lloyd stared in disbelief as one orc did weighted lunges while carrying a golden statue, and another squatted with a chest filled with gold balanced on his shoulders. They must have looted it all from some dungeon, but to them it wasn't treasure. Just equipment, tools for muscle. They trained with the enthusiasm of true muscle fanatics. Back in the present, Lloyd was standing beside Javier, leaning on a shovel as they watched the orcs finish their workout. He shifted slightly, voice low with excitement. His plan was taking shape. He would secure the orcs and the treasure. Javier held the contract in both hands, skimming through it with a furrowed brow. He read it aloud. The contractor would construct a Seok bingo. In return, the tribe would pay with their finest tools. Additionally, stone fitness equipment would be provided to encourage further trade. Javier narrowed his eyes. "What's a seok bingo?" he muttered, convinced Lloyd had made the word up. Lloyd casually explained. At the palace they used mages to cast freezing spells to keep food from spoiling. The seok bingo would serve the same purpose, without magic. Javier turned to him. "Where did you learn to build something like that?" Lloyd gave a slow shrug, casually brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. "Just something I picked up in a student society," he said, trying to sound offhand. Javier stared at him. Lloyd looked away. Clearly not buying it, Javier watched as Lloyd changed the subject entirely. He pointed to the mountain beside them. "That rock," he said. "It was perfect for construction. Incredibly dense. Extremely durable. It was granite." Javier studied the sheer face of the slope. Breaking it would be no easy task. Lloyd agreed. There was no dynamite here, but maybe they had something better. He slowly turned toward Javier, lips curling into a grin. Javier caught the look and sighed. "Here we go again." Lloyd kept grinning at him. Javier watched cautiously. That grin always meant trouble. Lloyd was already thinking back to the book. He remembered a city trapped behind a powerful magical barrier with thousands of people stuck inside. The knights had no way in until Javier stepped forward and unknowingly created a skill that tore the barrier apart in a single blast. Mana Blast. From then on, it became one of the hero's signature moves. Back in the present, Lloyd described the skill to him, its purpose, the power it released, and how it might work. When Javier asked how he even knew something like that, Lloyd paused just a second too long, then gave a smooth answer that felt like it had been prepared in advance. He acted like it was no big deal, claiming it just came to him on the spot. Javier didn't look convinced. He stood there a moment, clearly sceptical. But after a pause, he seemed to decide it might be worth trying for his own gain. Without another word, he turned toward the mountain. He drew in a breath and reached for his sword. Lloyd grinned to himself. If this worked, he was going to get so much use out of him. Javier stepped forward, planted his sword into the rock, and released the technique. A blinding flash erupted. Kaboom! The blast was enormous. Dust and stones scattered in every direction. Lloyd nearly lost his balance, caught off guard by the force. When the smoke cleared, Javier was still standing. His blue suit was gone, blasted apart, leaving only the collar and his bare chest exposed. He looked straight at Lloyd, as if asking whether he'd expected this exact outcome. Lloyd raised his hands in silent denial. Javier sighed and brushed the dust from himself. He figured Lloyd probably had more work lined up for him now. A system message flickered. Javier is grateful for learning a new skill. Approval rating increased by 3. Current approval, -11. Javier was still brushing off the dust from his arms when he muttered that knights shouldn't be using their sword techniques for construction. Lloyd didn't argue. He just smiled, clearly pleased with himself, then said there was no need to thank him. Javier replied that he wasn't going to. With the new skill unlocked, progress moved fast. Javier split the stone into neat blocks while Podong, as happy as ever to help, carried them one after another. The orcs joined in right away, offering advice to the humans on how to lift properly and avoid injury. Lloyd hadn't asked them to help. They simply didn't need an excuse to work out. He was leaning back on a rock, waving a hand fan lazily as he watched it all come together. Progress was faster than expected, and with orcs like these, they'd finish the build in no time. But something was bothering him. Lloyd asked about the men who'd gone to fetch the insulation. Javier told him it had been 3 weeks. Lloyd frowned. That was longer than it should have taken. Javier offered 2 possibilities. Either the men were slacking off, or something had happened to them. Lloyd stood, brushing his hands on his coat. If something had gone wrong, he needed to find out. Javier raised an arm to block his path, saying he should stay behind. If something had happened, then he would go check alone. But Lloyd didn't stop. He stared back at him and said he was responsible for his men's safety. He wasn't going to leave it to someone else. Javier held his gaze for a moment, then sighed and stepped aside. Then the two of them set off together. On the path toward Progia Gorge, Lloyd spotted something on the ground. He knelt and picked it up, a worn work glove, one of the pairs he'd made for the labourers. Scattered nearby was straw, the kind the men had been sent to collect for insulation. Not far off, Javier stood still, watching the gorge ahead. Something about the flow of mana there had caught his attention. It didn't feel natural, faint, but wrong. Lloyd rose slowly, brow furrowed. He rubbed his chin, deep in thought. The name of the gorge stirred something in his memory. There had been chapters about it. He was sure of it. Then it clicked. His hand dropped and his eyes widened. He told Javier there was no time to lose. The men may already be dead. Without hesitation, he pressed forward, urgency in every step. Javier followed, noting the shift in Lloyd's expression. Whatever he had remembered, it was serious. As they entered the gorge, more fragments of straw lined the path. The trail led them to a cave nestled in the rock wall. Lloyd stared at the entrance, recognizing the location from memory. This had to be it. Lupellen's dungeon. He remembered how the story went. A dark sorcerer had taken up residence here, a man who used forbidden magic and abducted innocents for his experiments. Javier had come here early in the novel and nearly died. Now Lloyd was facing the same place for real. His expression darkened. Someone had dared to lay hands on his workers, his property. His face twisted with rage at the thought. If anything had happened to them, the culprit would pay dearly. Javier stepped ahead, sword drawn, and moved to take point. Lloyd started to warn him, but it was already too late. Javier's foot pressed down on a faint magic circle etched into the stone. It lit up. Lloyd grabbed him and yanked him back just before the trap detonated. The blast flared in the spot where Javier had stood seconds earlier. Javier looked at the scorched rock, clearly surprised. Lloyd scolded him. Didn't they teach this at night school? Always check for traps when entering a dungeon. Just like in the book, Javier had walked straight into it. Lloyd reminded him that the mana flow felt wrong. If he focused on that, he could detect more of the traps. Javier closed his eyes, tuning in. The air thickened with threads of magic. As his focus sharpened, he spotted clumps of mana ahead, subtle circular patterns hidden near the floor. Traps. He began weaving a careful path between them. Lloyd followed behind, shovel resting over one shoulder. He casually said Javier was good at this. Javier didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the side, taking in Lloyd from the corner of his vision. He never explained how he knew any of this, but it was always just enough. Right place, right time, right advice. Nothing about him felt off, but none of it made sense either. Still, there were more important things to worry about. The men were somewhere inside, and they had to be found. Deeper inside the cave, Lupellen stood hunched over an open tome. The hood of his cloak cast a shadow over his face as he read. When he heard the faint echo of the earlier explosion, he paused. One of the traps had gone off. So someone had come. Well, they were probably dead by now. The ritual was nearly ready. He walked toward a thick iron door and pushed it open. Inside, Lloyd's missing men were bound at the wrists and ankles, lined up on their knees. Light from the cave spilled across their faces as they winced and squinted against it. Lupellen stepped in, grabbed one of them by the hair, and dragged him across the stone floor. The man struggled and begged, voice hoarse. He was thrown into a ritual circle drawn in red. Lupellen began chanting a dark incantation. Once he finished, he raised his scythe. The man screamed. Then a voice called out. Lupellen turned and saw two figures, Lloyd and Javier, standing there. Lloyd's voice cut through the chamber, low and threatening. He warned Lupellen to stop touching what belonged to him unless he wanted to die. Lupellen's surprise faded quickly. A magic circle formed on his outstretched palm, and the iron gate in front of him dropped with a heavy slam, crashing down between him and the intruders. Lloyd and Javier didn't move. A faint hiss spread through the air. Lupellin smiled. Sleeping gas was now filling the chamber, enough to knock out an elephant. Lloyd immediately held his breath. As the gate dropped, he activated his surveying skill to see through the stone, then followed it with Energizer. With both skills active, he began digging at high speed beneath the barrier, faster and sharper than before, now that he wasn't exhausted. Javier, unaffected by the gas, stood still. He'd suffered from insomnia for years, and no sleeping concoction he'd tried had ever worked. Something like this wouldn't even make him blink. He scratched his nose, thinking it might be allergies, then glanced down at Lloyd without concern. The way he moved through the dirt, he really was like a mole. He'd have to remember to mock him for that later. Lloyd popped back up and pointed at the tunnel's entrance. Javier followed. At the far end, he aimed his sword upward. Power gathered at the blade as he activated his new technique, Mana Blast. With a sharp flash and a deafening boom, the top of the tunnel burst open. On the other side, Lupellin stumbled back in shock. A hand reached through the smoke. Then Lloyd climbed out. He wore his usual shameless expression as he asked Lupellin if he'd ever seen a better entrance. Lupellin scowled as magic circles began to glow on each of his hands. He slammed both palms onto the ground. The two circles merged, forming one large ritual symbol beneath his feet. From it, a massive creature rose, stitched together from body parts large enough to form a towering monster, nearly reaching the cavern ceiling. His failed reincarnation ritual had produced this ghoul, and while it wasn't what he wanted, it was still powerful. This creature is strong, there's no way they can scratch it. The creature loomed over Lloyd and Javier. Lloyd barely had time to start explaining its weakness, but Javier was already moving. He'd launched forward, sword drawn, and brought it down with a blinding wave of fire. The blast engulfed the ghoul and split it clean down the middle. The corpse collapsed, motionless. Lupellin stared in horror. Even Lloyd was surprised. This hadn't happened in the book. They stood side by side now, Lloyd with his shovel resting over his shoulder, Javier quietly sheathing his sword. Lupellin dropped to the floor, trembling. Lloyd stepped closer, knelt, and looked him dead in the eye. His brow was furrowed. This man had set his project back weeks. How did he plan to pay for that? Lupellin collapsed into a bow, begging for forgiveness. Lloyd cut him off. He didn't care about apologies. He wanted compensation. Scrambling to respond, Lupellin offered all the valuables in the cave. Everything he had. Lloyd smiled. Javier stepped out from the back, supporting one of the men with an arm over his shoulder. He said he found the others. They were all alive, just exhausted. Lloyd nodded, eyes still fixed on Lupellin. He asked why the men had been starved. Lupellin didn't look up. His voice came low and hoarse. He said he was researching how to bring someone back from the dead. His wife and child had been taken from him. He worked under a noble once. They'd tried to escape, but the noble caught them. Lloyd cut him off before he could finish. He didn't need to hear it. He asked what his family would think if they saw what he'd done. Murdering innocent people in their name. Did he really think they'd thank him? Lupellin went silent. Lloyd gestured toward the remains of the ghoul. All those people sacrificed, and for what? Did none of their lives matter? Lupellin looked down, saying nothing. Lloyd rose to his feet. He told him plainly. He'd return soon with workers to claim what was owed. He turns away and tells the man he will show no mercy if he tries anything like that again. Behind him, Lupellin collapsed, dropping to his knees. He pressed his forehead to the floor and muttered his thanks, but Lloyd kept walking. He already knew how this story played out. In the original version, Javier had spared the sorcerer, believed he could be redeemed. But he'd gone on to slaughter countless others, becoming a monster himself, and returned as a recurring villain, always getting in Javier's way. So why was Lloyd walking away? Because he was waiting. He heard the shift of movement behind him. Lupellin raised his head, eyes wild with hatred. A glowing circle spread across his palm. Magic burst to life as he lunged forward to strike. Lloyd turned his head slightly, catching him in the act with a cold stare. He reminded him. He'd already warned him once. Javier's blade sliced clean through his neck. The head hit the floor. It bounced once, then rolled to a stop. Lloyd stood over the body, silent. He was thinking back to his days on the construction site. There was this one guy older than him, always abusive for no reason. Every day was the same. No matter how many times Lloyd apologised or tried to be respectful, the man kept pushing, kept getting worse. Until one day he crossed a line, said something about Lloyd's parents. Lloyd snapped. He lost control and beat the man senseless. Over and over until someone had to drag him off. After that, the man never said another word to him again. Sometimes violence does solve problems. Back in Korea, he thought, murderers are given a slap on the wrist. But Lloyd didn't agree with that. Sometimes villains deserved a fitting punishment. He looked back at the headless corpse, then turned and walked away. The cave behind them was silent now. Lupellin was gone, the prisoners freed, and the worst of it over. Lloyd led the group down the forest path, the late afternoon sun filtering through the trees above. The rescued men followed behind him, carrying what supplies they could, though some moved slower than others. One soldier in particular was struggling. The pack on his back sagged under its weight, his legs unsteady from days spent in chains. He gritted his teeth, trying to keep pace, but it was clear he was barely holding up. Lloyd looked back. He called out, telling the man to hand over his bag. The soldier shook his head, insisting he could manage. Lloyd clicked his tongue and furrowed his brow. If the man collapsed, he'd have to carry both him and the supplies. If it was going to end that way anyway, he might as well take it now. He reached out and took the bag anyway. Then he turned to the others and told them to hand over theirs too. They hesitated. A few even tried to protest. Lloyd didn't give them the chance. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. Grudgingly, the rest of the men handed over their loads. Lloyd tied the bags together, ignoring their mutters that they could still carry their own. Once everything was secured, he slung the bundle over his back with a grunt, and then, with a casual glance over his shoulder, warned them that if he heard another word, their bonuses were getting slashed. That was enough to quiet them down. The men stared at him, stunned. Some looked ready to cry. Javier, walking a few paces behind, narrowed his eyes. He couldn't tell if Lloyd actually believed he might need to carry one of them, or if it was just an excuse to help without looking soft. Whatever the truth, the men clearly believed the latter. To them, Master Lloyd was more than just a noble or commander. He was someone they'd follow without question. Then the system chimed in. The rescued soldiers have been deeply moved by your actions. Through their words, your deeds are spreading far and wide. Wasn't this a rewarding experience? Lloyd didn't slow down. He rolled his eyes at the prompt. If there was no profit involved, he couldn't care less. Some time had passed since their return. Construction at the orc camp was nearly complete, and the new building stood tall at the edge of the clearing, solid, sturdy, and well built. Inside, Arosh paced slowly across the stone floor. He looked around, taking in the space with a satisfied nod, until his expression turned uncertain. He turned to Lloyd. It was only slightly cooler in here than it was outside. How was this going to preserve meat? Lloyd didn't look concerned. He told Arosh they just needed to bring the ice in first. Arosh blinked. Ice? There wasn't a shred of snow or frost anywhere nearby. Where exactly was Lloyd planning to get ice? Lloyd smiled. He was going to make some. Arosh frowned, unconvinced. How? Lloyd kept smiling and simply said he'd find a way. That didn't help. As if picking up on Arosh's doubts, the system chimed in with perfect timing. Did he bring a con man back to the village? Was the story about the queen ant all a lie? Arosh is not as stupid as Lloyd thinks he is. Shut up, Lloyd thought. You can't actually read minds, you're just messing with me. Arosh gave him a side-eye, but didn't push it. He shook his head. Maybe he shouldn't doubt Lloyd so quickly. After all, this was the same man who had pulled him out of a cave full of ants. He turned to leave, calling over his shoulder that if Lloyd needed anything, all he had to do was ask. Once Arosh was gone, Javier turned toward Lloyd. So how exactly did he plan to make ice? Lloyd didn't answer right away. He hesitated, then muttered that it was a good question, one he was definitely in the middle of figuring out. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He glanced at Javier and casually asked what he thought they should do. Javier's expression twisted in disbelief. He stared at Lloyd. Had he seriously promised ice to the orcs without even knowing if he could do it? Was this really the plan? Bluff first, figure it out later? Was he planning to con them? Lloyd turned, straightened his shoulders and told Javier to listen closely. What was the one thing unsuccessful people had in common? They always found excuses when things got tough. But the successful ones? They figured it out, no matter the circumstances. That was how innovation happened. That was what separated failure from greatness. That was the mindset of an entrepreneur. He raised his fist in the air as he said it, loud and proud. Javier stared at him, clearly not convinced. Night fell over the camp, and most of the orcs had turned in for the evening. Lloyd sat outside alone, perched on a rock, chin resting on his hands as he stared off in thought. He needed a plan. The structure was built. The orcs were counting on him. All he had to do now was make ice in a region that had probably never seen it. He had an idea. He'd build a mould for the block. Once that was done, he'd get Padong and Bangul to haul water from the lake and pour it in. That part was easy. The problem was freezing it. There was ice magic in this world, so it had to be possible. He just didn't know how it worked. He remembered the mana flows he sensed while training the Azrahan core technique. There had been subtle differences in the way it moved, sharp in one moment, slow in another. If he could shift the properties of mana, maybe he could create the same cooling effect. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. A slow grin crept onto his face. He wasn't a master of mana manipulation, but he didn't need to be. If he could imitate the effect, just enough to get the job done, that would be enough. The mould had been built and filled with water by now. Enough time had passed for the idea to take shape and the setup to be ready. Lloyd knelt beside it, pressed his palm against the surface, and closed his eyes. The mana inside the water pulsed against his senses. He focused, tried to guide it. It resisted at first, slippery and unfocused, but he kept pushing. Behind him, Javier leaned against the outer wall of the building, arms crossed. Watching Lloyd try to figure out magic like this, on the fly, without theory or guidance, looked reckless. At least that's what he used to think. But from what he could tell, Lloyd was making progress. Javier let out a quiet breath. Once Lloyd decided he was going to do something, there really was no stopping him. Kneeling by the mould, Lloyd kept his hands submerged as cold mist began to rise around him. The temperature shifted, barely at first, then steadily more. A notification flashed in his vision. You have developed a new application of the Azrahan core technique. Technique has leveled up. Current level 2. A few days later, the building was finally complete. Insulated, sealed, and cold. Inside, Arosh and his father stood near the centre, arms folded as they breathed out faint clouds of mist. A thick block of ice sat on the stone floor, its surface frosted and solid. The chill in the room was undeniable. They looked at each other, then at the ice, then back at Lloyd. He'd actually done it. Lloyd stepped forward and tapped the block with the back of his hand. The sound echoed dully through the space. All that was left now was to finish the insulation. Once that was done, they'd have their cold room. The job was as good as complete. The orcs were speechless. For a people who had hunted daily just to keep up with spoilage, this changed everything. Meat could be preserved. Food could last. It wasn't just a building anymore, it was freedom from constant worry. The chief raised a hand, voice booming with pride. In celebration of this success, he declared the entire village would enjoy a triceps day. Lloyd didn't even try to hide his smirk. He turned to Javier, then pointed to the ice. That was the mind of an entrepreneur, and he made sure Javier got the message. Javier stared at his face. He didn't need to hear the words. He already knew what Lloyd was thinking, and annoyingly, he had to admit, Lloyd was right. Now that construction was complete, the orcs had gathered in the centre of the village. The chief stood before the crowd, his voice steady as he thanked Lloyd for fulfilling his promise. Lloyd gave a small nod in response. He said the chief was too kind. He had simply honoured the contract. But the chief continued. The Sand and Steel tribe didn't have an easy relationship with humans. A contract alone didn't guarantee trust. Just because something was written didn't mean it would be upheld. And yet, Lloyd had kept his word. Now they knew he could be trusted. The chief raised his hand and announced that they wished to make a vow. He drew a deep breath and straightened his back, chest pushed out with pride. Then with a mighty cry, he declared, from this moment on, the Sand and Steel tribe and the Frontera family were blood brothers. The villagers erupted into cheers. All across the square, the orcs struck a pose, flexed arms, fists raised like proud bodybuilders, and roared in unison. Blood brothers! The chief turned to Lloyd and told him plainly they were friends now, and any enemy of the Frontera family would be the enemy of the tribe as well. A system notification flashed before Lloyd's eyes. The orc tribe has accepted you as a true friend. Approval rating increased, RP plus 100. Lloyd grinned, pumped a fist in front of his chest and shouted back, "Long live the Sand and Steel tribe!" After a long journey, Lloyd finally returned home. He walked through the heart of town with confident strides, followed by 120 towering orcs. The effect was immediate. Citizens froze in place. Shopkeepers dropped what they were holding. Some ran for cover. Others just stood there, wide-eyed and shaking. Lloyd glanced around at the reactions and let out a quiet sigh. Right, he thought. Might be a good time to make an announcement. If people didn't understand the orcs were allies now, panic would only spread. Orcs weren't exactly known for putting humans at ease. When he finally arrived at the manor, he spotted the Baron watching from one of the upper windows. Even though he'd known about the alliance, his face said he wasn't entirely comfortable with it. Still, Lloyd had more pressing tasks at hand. He needed to find a few wealthy merchants willing to move the treasure he'd acquired from the orc camp. On top of that, there was still a pile of items taken from the dark sorcerer's lair that needed sorting. Lloyd sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by items he'd hauled back from the orc camp and Lupellin's cave. Stacks of loot, strange tools, and magical relics cluttered the space. Gold and silver were easy enough to offload to merchants, but he wasn't interested in just cash. Not yet. There could be something useful here. Something powerful. And if there was, he didn't intend to overlook it. Javier stood behind him, arms crossed, and asked if there was anything valuable in the dark sorcerer's belongings. Lloyd said he wasn't sure. He wanted to go through everything properly before selling any of it, just in case something useful was buried inside. Then he froze. His expression shifted. His eyes locked on something inside the book he was holding. Without another word, he grabbed it and stood up fast. He called out that he was heading to the mine and left the rest to Javier as he bolted from the room. Lloyd burst into the mine, calling out for Tordes. Eventually the tired worker emerged from the tunnels, face streaked with dirt and shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Lloyd stepped forward and placed both hands on his shoulders. His excitement was hard to miss. He reminded Tordes of the contract he'd signed, the absurd one that locked him into 520 years of labour. Tordes remembered. His expression said it all. Still grinning, Lloyd told him not to worry. He'd found a spell buried in one of the dark sorcerer's books, one that could turn Tordes into a ghoul he could control. Now he could actually work the 520 years off. Wasn't that amazing? Tordes didn't respond. He stood there, unmoving, as if his soul had just left his body. Lloyd repeated himself, beaming. Wasn't this incredible? Still nothing. Slowly, the smile dropped from his face. His expression turned cold as he stared at Tordes in silence. Then he asked, face still cold, why he was the only one excited about this arrangement. He told Tordes to smile. After a moment, the man blinked and obeyed. Sort of. His mouth forced its way into a smile, while tears welled up in his eyes and slid down his cheeks. Lloyd seemed satisfied with that. He snapped his fingers, pointed at him, and told him to keep up the good work, then turned and walked away, clearly in high spirits. The system chimed in with a prompt. The Lord of the Underworld was impressed and would like to offer Lloyd a position. He dismissed it immediately, assuming the system was joking. But the system clarified that it was serious. Lloyd, far too pleased with himself to care, didn't hear a word of it. Later, Lloyd made his way through the halls of the manor. He figured it was time to speak with the Baron. His first stop was the office, but it was empty. Just as he stepped back out into the corridor, he spotted a maid passing by and stopped her to ask if she'd seen his father. She told him the Baron had guests and was currently in the reception room. Lloyd asked who the visitors were. The maid replied, Mr. Shiloh and Mr. Meatloaf. The answer made him pause. Then his expression twisted, something sly creeping across his face. So the lenders were here. And the moment he realised it, the shift in his face was enough to make the maid flinch. She asked what kind of expression that was supposed to be. He didn't answer. He was already headed down the hall. In the reception room, Arcos sat across from the two lenders. They were already mid-discussion. The lenders laid out their proposal. If the Frontera family handed over the mine, they would consider 90% of the remaining debt repaid. Arcos looked unsure. They told him it was a generous deal and asked why he was hesitating. There was a knock at the door. A voice asked to come in. Arcos answered, and the door opened. Lloyd stood in the doorway, wearing an obviously fake smile. He greeted the lenders and said it had been a while. He hoped they'd been well. Meatloaf instantly pulled out a piece of paper and held it out. This time they had an official invitation, so Lloyd couldn't threaten them any longer. Lloyd gasped, looking impressed. Of course they did. They were men of intellect, after all. Still smiling, he said he couldn't help but overhear their generous offer. He asked if he might offer one of his own. Meatloaf scowled, saying he didn't want to hear anything from Lloyd. Lloyd told him anyway. From now on, the repayments would switch to smaller monthly fees, and the interest rate would be lowered. Meatloaf pointed at Lloyd and shouted, "How dare he!" He already told him he didn't intend to listen to anything he proposed. Still swaying slightly with that same fake smile, he clasped his hands and said it didn't seem fair. They could spit out bad offers, but he wasn't allowed to make any of his own. That kind of thing made him angry. Heavy footsteps began with a loud thud behind him. A large orc stepped into the room and stood directly behind Lloyd. The lenders recoiled in fear. The orc glared at them and warned that anyone who caused trouble for the Frontera family would be destroyed. Lloyd tapped the orc's chest and told him it wasn't that serious. They weren't being hostile. The orc replied that he definitely heard hostility in their voices earlier. The lenders were now clinging to each other in silence. He and the orc both stared at them. Lloyd's smile stretched wide, unhinged and unsettling. The orc added that if they hurt the Frontera family's feelings, he'd tear them apart. Oink. A short while later, the lenders were seen sprinting away from the mansion gates, flailing as if death itself was chasing them. Whatever negotiations had taken place, they clearly hadn't gone in their favour. Back inside, Lloyd sat on a couch in the reception room, flipping through the newly signed contract. It was a major win, far better terms, significantly less interest, and the debt was finally on track to be paid off properly. Sure, he could have crushed them completely, but he wasn't a criminal. Probably. Arcos remained close, observing him silently. He gave Lloyd a nod of approval and thanked him for handling the situation. Lloyd handed the contract to his father and told him to keep it safe. He added that business was booming, the mines were running well, and with the new terms they'd be free of debt in no time. But then, his expression shifted. He glanced at Arosh, who was standing beside them. Lloyd smiled uneasily and pointed out that the orcs ate a lot. A whole lot. Probably 10 times as much as a regular person. If they didn't figure something out soon, they'd find themselves back in debt before they knew it. Arcos froze. And just like that, their next problem had already begun to take shape. Orcs, as it turned out, were born for the mines. Lloyd had expected as much, but even he was impressed by the reality. Deep underground, one of his men sprinted toward him, breathless and pale. He didn't waste time. He grabbed Lloyd and dragged him toward one of the tunnels, pointing at a towering orc who was still swinging a pickaxe like his life depended on it. That was the one. The same orc he'd reported earlier. He hadn't left the mine in over 24 hours. Lloyd groaned. He told the men to pull him out and bar him from entering again until he'd had at least one full day of rest. The orc kicked, thrashed and shouted all the way out, demanding more time to work out. Lloyd, now talking to Arosh, asked how much they should pay the orcs for all this. Arosh simply grunted. Orcs didn't care for wages. As long as Lloyd kept them fed, they'd keep working without complaint. After that conversation, Lloyd and his father talked about keeping the orcs fed, since they consumed 10 times the amount of a human. They needed more money to feed them, but in return, the mines would earn vastly more with the extra productivity the orcs provided. Arcos looked down at the ground and admitted he didn't want the people to suffer just to make more profit. They were already struggling, and the thought of raising taxes didn't sit well with him. Lloyd reassured him. He didn't plan to bleed the people dry. Doing that would ruin the barony's economy. Arcos asked what his plan was then. Lloyd told him it was simple. If they helped the people become prosperous, more taxes would return naturally. He explained that they had land nearby, the Maritz wetlands. If they could turn that into usable farmland and give it to the people, it would bring in far more income for the barony over time. Later, we cut to Lloyd and Javier walking through the wetlands. Javier pointed out that this land had been abandoned for hundreds of years. How could anyone possibly farm here? Lloyd told him he had a plan, and to just wait and see. But as they walked, he admitted to himself that he wasn't sure it would work. Stopping the flooding on terrain like this wasn't easy. If he wanted to build here, the drainage had to be perfect. He sat down and began working on a scaled model of the land, carving out channels and adjusting the dirt to redirect water properly. It wasn't going to be quick, but if he could get the drainage right, the rest would follow. 3 weeks later, Lloyd was still there, moving dirt and adjusting the drainage plan. His eyes were tired, his body worn down. From a distance, Javier and Arcos stood watching him. Arcos asked how long Lloyd had been like this. Javier told him it had been 21 days. He added that Lloyd hadn't been eating or resting properly, and asked if he should stop him. Arcos shook his head. He said he used to hate his son, but looking at him now, it was like he was a completely different person. Someone working to help the people. He didn't want to get in his way. Javier nodded. He agreed. Even if they wanted to stop Lloyd, it wouldn't matter. Once he set his mind on something, he never gave up. If he said he would do something, he would see it through. It was night now, and after many days of work, Lloyd had finally done it. Kneeling beside the scaled land drainage system, he raised his hands and gritted his teeth in relief. Now the money could flow, he thought. He fell back in exhaustion, lying flat on the ground. That was exhausting, but he did it. It wasn't even that bad, especially compared to the construction work he used to do back in Korea. As he lay there, a chime rang out and a screen appeared in front of his face. It informed him that, due to his efforts in architectural design, he had unlocked a new skill. He read the text aloud from the screen. Design skill option 3, simulation mode. He could now create a virtual simulation when surveying land. He activated his surveying skill and looked toward the distant mountains. A grid formed over the landscape, and as he moved his fingers, he could alter the shape of the terrain in real time, the system simulating structural integrity as he adjusted the layout. Lloyd barked at the screen. Why was it only telling him this now? This would have saved him from working non-stop for nearly a month. The system answered, sarcastically. It reminded him that he just said it wasn't so bad. Then it told him the skill had only awakened because of his hard work. It was all thanks to his wish. Lloyd leaned back, resting on his hands. He remembered the system mentioning that when he first arrived in this world, but he still didn't understand. What wish? All he wanted was to get through college, get his license, land a good job, and make money. The system told him those were just goals. A wish was something stronger, something that transcended time and space. Lloyd stood up and dusted himself off. If it was going to stay vague, then he was done. He had work to do. He called out to Padong and Bangul. They popped into view, each landing on one of his shoulders, smiling brightly. Lloyd smiled back at them, then asked if they'd like a new friend. It was morning now. Lloyd stood before the wetlands as the sun rose in the distance. He declared it was time to begin Stage 1 of the Marit's Wetlands reclamation. Turning to Padong and Bangul, still perched on his shoulders, he told them their job was to remove the water from the wetlands. They recoiled in shock at the idea. Padong protested, and Lloyd, understanding the creature, repeated what it was trying to say. The job was too big for the two of them. He reassured them. That's why he planned to find them a new friend. He opened his screen and loaded the summon game. It would cost 100 RP to summon. Lloyd noticed the cost had gone up again. The first summon had been only 50. The third, now it was 100. He hit the start button and activated the summon game. He just needed to find a creature with the right skills to remove water. With his current points, he figured he could probably summon 7 times. The summoning circle formed with a loud, buzzing hum. A moment later, a small head shot out from the circle with tremendous speed and slammed directly into Lloyd's face. He stumbled back, a bit of blood streaming from his nose. The creature bounced onto the ground with a cheerful thud, revealing a hippo-like figure smiling up at him. Lloyd looked down at it. It looked like a hippo. Maybe it would help with the water. Padong and Bangul greeted their new friend joyfully, the 3 of them dancing in circles, laughing and spinning together. Lloyd didn't want to interrupt the celebration. He politely asked the creature for its instruction manual. It spat a soggy wad of paper at his feet. Lloyd, now used to this, picked it up and peeled it open to read. His brow furrowed as he scanned the contents. It didn't grow with sunflower seeds like the others. That was strange. He looked back down at the little creature. This one might be a dud, he thought. Lloyd, unimpressed, told the system to restart the summoning game. The system responded with a prompt. Only 1 summon was allowed per day. Annoyed, he realised he'd just wasted today's chance. Hamang kept his eyes fixed on the ground, tears welling up. Bangul immediately stepped in, scolding Lloyd and insisting he stop being mean. Lloyd knelt and apologised. It wasn't personal. He simply needed something larger to handle all the water in the wetlands. But Bangul and Podong weren't satisfied. With a dramatic flourish, they pulled out signs and banners from nowhere, protesting on behalf of their new friend. They demanded it be treated as a valued labourer. Lloyd gave in and decided to give it a chance. He asked to see what it could do. Hamang's face lit up. The system chimed in, alerting him to a new skill: 1 shot. Lloyd tried to figure out what the skill actually did. Based on Hamang's proud gestures, it seemed to mean it could drink massive amounts of water, as much as its belly could hold. He remained sceptical. It was so small there was no way it could hold that much. But Hamang waddled off toward the swamp and signalled for Lloyd to follow. At the water's edge, it lowered its head and started drinking. At first, Lloyd watched with mild interest. But then Hamang began to grow, first to the size of a large dog, then larger, and it kept going. Lloyd's gaze slowly tilted upward as it expanded right in front of him. Soon, it was massive, even larger than Podong after eating a seed. Behind it, the swampy lake had nearly vanished. Hamang leaned back with a contented sigh, the full contents of the lake now in its belly. Lloyd stared at the dry basin, stunned. It had only taken a few minutes. At this rate, they could drain the entire wetlands in days. Podong and Bangul gave him smug, satisfied looks. Still processing what he'd seen, Lloyd asked the system if it was really just coincidence, that every creature he summoned had ended up being exactly what he needed. The system's response was vague. This was part of his skill. He was put in an unlucky situation. Maybe this was a way of balancing things out. Who knows, it said. Lloyd wasn't satisfied, but it was typical of the system. Hamang let out a sound and gestured toward the swamp again. Lloyd gave a small nod. If it still had room for more, then by all means, let it keep going. Reclamation of the Marit's wetlands had officially begun. Lloyd's plan was simple. Hamang would keep draining the wetlands and transfer the water into the nearby river. Once the water was cleared, the next step was to remove debris and weeds from the newly exposed ground. Then came the reshaping. Javier would open holes in the soil using Mana Blast, and they'd insert bamboo stalks to act as channels. Sand was brought in to form sandbanks, and Podong packed everything down with its weight. With the bamboo in place, Hamang could use the stalks to drain deeper groundwater straight from beneath the soil. Finally, using his upgraded simulation skill, Lloyd designed a levee to stabilise the land and prevent future flooding. It took 10 days, but they completed the first section. Lloyd gathered the men and gave them a rallying cry. They'd done well, but there was still more work ahead. Once it was all finished, he told them, they could throw a party. His treat. The men erupted in cheers as Lloyd raised his shovel above his head with both hands, standing proud in the reclaimed land. Weeks later, Javier stood at the edge of the cleared wetlands, surveying the land. It was actually starting to look like farmland. Then the thought hit him. When had he become a full-time labourer? Lloyd came running up, calling his name. He handed Javier a pouch and pointed off in the distance, telling him to plant the seeds over there. Javier started to protest. He was a knight. This wasn't his job. But Lloyd cut him off. The seeds were for pest control, and their land needed saving. He called him Dear Knight and asked for his help. Javier couldn't argue with that. Not when Lloyd put it that way. He knelt down and began planting, grumbling under his breath. Lloyd's scheming had worked again. Somehow, he needed to find a way out of this and return to his role as a knight. As he watered the seeds, a voice came from behind. It was Arcos. He said Lloyd had kept his word. He'd actually turned the wetlands into usable land. It was an amazing feat. The farmers working nearby looked up as Lloyd passed through, inspecting the sandbanks. A notification appeared before him. Everyone in Frontera Barony had gained newfound respect and awe for what he had achieved. The system rewarded him with a large RP bonus. Lloyd smirked and continued walking, satisfied with the result. Some time later, the seeds Javier had planted were growing well. He tended them carefully, and to his own surprise, he felt real satisfaction at seeing them grow. Not far from him, Lloyd sat on a sandbank, leaning back with both hands behind him. He glanced over at Javier and started talking about his next project, a water wheel. If it rained, they needed a way to move water off the land before it pooled again. Otherwise, the wetlands would reclaim what they'd just built. Before Javier could respond, the sound of hooves echoed from the road. Lloyd sat up and looked toward the source. A group of riders was approaching on horseback. He turned to Javier and asked if he recognised them. Javier did. He said it was Viscount Lacona from the northern part of the Marit's wetlands. The lead rider came forward and asked who was in charge. Javier stepped in, ready to correct the man for not showing proper respect, but Lloyd raised a hand, stopping him. He turned calmly to the rider and asked if he needed something. The man explained that this land belonged to Viscount Lacona. The Viscount rode forward beside him without a word. Then came the order. Lloyd was to leave these lands at once. Lloyd looked over the group of riders and asked if they were claiming he was trespassing. The lead man at the front answered, "Yes. This land had been granted to Viscount Lacona by His Royal Highness." Lloyd cut him off immediately. If the nobleman were going to talk, then a lowlife like him had no business opening his mouth. The man clearly took offence. A vein bulged at his temple as his anger surged. Lloyd turned toward the Viscount and gave a formal bow, introducing himself as the son of Baron Frontera. The Viscount looked down on him from horseback, unimpressed. He claimed he'd heard of Lloyd, and of his crude behaviour. He saw no reason to speak with someone like him and demanded he bring his father instead. Javier stood still, unamused by the Viscount's tone. The Viscount repeated himself, louder this time. "Bring your father. Was Lloyd deaf?" Lloyd, casually picking his ear, replied that his hearing was perfectly fine. He just thought he'd heard a buzzing insect. The Viscount glanced around, confused, asking where the bug was. The man beside him leaned in and whispered that Lloyd had been talking about him. The Viscount blinked, stunned. "Really?" Before the Viscount could respond, Lloyd straightened up and began calmly reciting the Land Act of 321, the section dealing with the development of barren land. Clause by clause, he laid it out. The law was clear. If land had been abandoned for over 100 years, and someone had invested capital, developed it, and produced a crop, he pulled an onion from the ground and held it up, then ownership legally transferred to that party's barony. The more he spoke, the more flustered the Viscount became. Javier stood frozen in disbelief. He thought back to when Lloyd had handed him the seeds, saying they were just for pest control. So this was what he meant. Lloyd turned to the Viscount with a pleasant smile and congratulated him. He'd just witnessed history, the first harvest of the Maritz wetlands. Then, still smiling, he held out the onion. A gift. Free of charge, of course. The Viscount was livid, still trying to process how this had happened. Lloyd kept smiling as he handed him the onion. Then his expression turned cold. "Now get off my land." As the riders turned their horses and began to leave, Javier leaned in and asked if Lloyd had received a prophecy or something. How had he known they would come? Lloyd scoffed. It wasn't his first time dealing with people like this. Parasites who only showed up when the hard work was already done. Behind them, a loud cheer erupted from the workers and farmers. They were clapping and celebrating after watching the Viscount get chased off. Lloyd glanced back at them and narrowed his eyes. Were they being paid to cheer? He told them to get back to work. Summer had come to an end, and autumn arrived with storms and heavy rain. Lloyd sat alone on the banks, soaked to the skin. He didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the land. He was watching to see if the fields would hold, if the floodwaters would rise, or if his new contraption, the water wheel, would work the way it was supposed to. He had run countless simulations, but this was real. He needed to see it with his own eyes. An umbrella opened over him. Javier had arrived without a word, holding it above Lloyd's head to shield him from the rain. When the downpour finally passed, Lloyd was still there. No flooding, no collapse. The drainage system had worked. The land held. A notification appeared before him. The system informed him that he had achieved another engineering feat. His work had now left a mark on the history of the Laurasia continent. A wave of skill experience poured in. Several of his engineering abilities levelled up at once. Approval ratings increased across the Frontera barony. Lloyd stood slowly, water dripping from his coat, and looked out across the farmland. It was holding. He gave a quiet nod. Now for the next stage. Meanwhile, in the Lacona Viscounty, the Viscount sat behind his desk, fists clenched as his administrator finished delivering the news. It was true. The reclaimed wetlands now legally belonged to the Frontera barony. He slammed his hand on the desk, furious. Those lands were going to generate serious wealth, and he had lost them. All that potential handed away by a legal technicality. He barked at the administrator to summon the supervisor of the dye shop immediately. If Frontera thought this was over, he was sorely mistaken. He wasn't going to let it go without a fight. A few days later, Lloyd woke up with a pounding headache. He sat up slowly, grimacing. Maybe he'd been working too hard. A little rest wouldn't hurt, but there was still too much to do. Beside the bed, Javier was slumped in a chair, hugging a pillow and sleeping like a baby. Lloyd nudged him and said it was time to get up. Javier stirred, groaned, then held his head in his hand. He looked just as miserable. Lloyd asked if he was all right. Javier muttered that he'd never had a headache like this before. Lloyd narrowed his eyes, then paused. Something clicked. These headaches. It couldn't be. All across the Frontera barony, the people were suffering. Everyone had the same symptoms, splitting headaches that refused to fade. Even the farm animals had stopped drinking entirely. Lloyd walked through town beside Javier, watching the growing unease. The villagers were sick. The livestock wouldn't drink. Everything pointed to the water. But even with his knowledge of the story, Lloyd couldn't predict this. His interference had already caused deviations, and now information he once relied on was unreliable. He'd expected the Viscount to try claiming the wetlands. That part was easy to prepare for. He'd researched Lacona thoroughly in advance. Their wealth came from one thing: their dye workshop. Specifically, the berries used to produce the dye. Those berries also had another effect. Lloyd's steps slowed. His expression darkened as the pieces fell into place. Rage overtook him. He cursed loudly. He knew exactly what that bastard had done. Back at the manor, Arcos sat in the reception room with a knight from Lacona. The knight had just finished delivering his so-called offer. If the Frontera barony handed over half of the reclaimed wetlands, Lacona would stop dumping dye factory wastewater into the river. Arcos stared in disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was this blackmail? He glared at the knight, his voice low and furious. They wouldn't get away with this. He would report them to the authorities. The knight chuckled. He didn't deny it. Sure, they could go to court, but even if they won, it would take years before a verdict came down. 2 years of legal fees, 2 years of buying drinking water. Could they survive that long? Arcos clenched his fists. He was seething. The knight stood and turned for the door, saying he looked forward to Arcos's response. But just as he reached it, the doors burst open, slamming into him and pinning him against the wall with a loud thud. Lloyd strolled in casually and bowed to Arcos. He announced that he had urgent news, specifically that their parasitic neighbours had been poisoning their water supply. He was here to discuss countermeasures. The knight peeled himself off the wall, red-faced and enraged. He shouted at Lloyd, demanding to know if he'd just insulted his master. Lloyd feigned surprise. He hadn't realised a parasite could understand human speech. The knight was livid now. Without hesitation, he challenged Lloyd to a duel to defend his and his master's honour. The duel had been accepted, and now it was already over. The knight lay curled up on the ground, sobbing and bruised, shielding himself from the rain of blows coming from Lloyd's shovel. He was shouting that he yielded, that he gave up, that it was enough. Lloyd paused for a moment, shovel raised, then casually stated he was satisfied, before striking again, reminding the knight he still owed him for insulting the Baron. From the stands, Arcos tried to act composed. He called out for Lloyd to stop, claiming the duel was over. But the smile tugging at his lips betrayed him. He wasn't exactly upset about it. Javier, on the other hand, stood speechless. He'd never seen his lord like this before. Back in the Lacona region, the knight returned in disgrace. His face was swollen. Bruises covered nearly every inch of his body. He stood before the Viscount, battered and miserable, asking for forgiveness. But the Viscount was livid. He had sent him to deliver a threat, not get humiliated in public. But then, a thought came to him. Maybe this could work in their favour. The knight didn't understand. The Viscount explained. If the Frontera barony took them to court, they could spin the duel into an unprovoked assault. It would win them sympathy. It would stall proceedings. And dragging things out was all they needed. He laughed to himself, already imagining the delays. At that exact moment, Lloyd was playing out the same scenario in his head. His expression matched the Viscount's twisted grin. He knew exactly how that man was thinking. Then he turned, stepping to the edge of the manor roof, and faced the group assembled below, orc and human alike. He raised his voice, rallying them. He reminded them of everything they had worked for, and how easily it could all be taken away by greed. They had bled for this land. They wouldn't let anyone steal it now. He shouted the final words, shovel raised high above his head. The workers roared back in unison, their voices filled with fire. Lloyd and Javier stood near the newly built reservoir, going over the next steps. He had already used Hamang to transfer clean water from farther upstream beyond the contaminated stretch. Javier nodded in approval. It was a solid move, but only temporary. He pointed out that it wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later, they'd need a more permanent solution. Lloyd agreed. He explained the next phase, constructing a water supply system that would pull water all the way from Lake Capua in the eastern mountains. Javier looked at him, startled. That was a massive undertaking, and the cost would be enormous. Lloyd reassured him with a confident smile. He'd be the one building it, and if he was doing the work, he might as well charge a fortune for it. A few months later, the Viscount wasn't looking so confident. The dye workshop was failing. Profits had plummeted. Nothing was working as it used to. He sat slouched in his chair, visibly strained, until his administrator entered to announce a guest. The Viscount snapped at him. He didn't want to see anyone. But the administrator insisted. The guest said they could help with his current problems. Moments later, Lloyd and Javier entered the room. Lloyd didn't wait for permission to sit. He dropped himself onto the Viscount's ornate couch, legs casually kicked up on the table, that smug grin plastered across his face. He commented on how rough the Viscount looked, not quite the same man who'd tried to threaten them. The Viscount narrowed his eyes, demanding to know what Lloyd wanted. Lloyd waved it off, saying he was here to help. After all, wasn't the Viscount having a little trouble with his dye workshop? That was when the Viscount put it together. He demanded to know if Lloyd had orchestrated this. Lloyd leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. It hadn't been easy. Because of the poisoned water, he'd been forced to find another source, and digging a channel all the way from Lake Capua wasn't exactly convenient. They hadn't known about the waste initially, but thanks to the knight so kindly confirming that Lacona had dumped it on purpose, they had no choice but to reroute everything. They'd buried pipelines, laid out channels, even crossed a massive valley. That valley had been the problem. So they blasted through limestone to build an aqueduct. And of course, some of that lime-rich debris had fallen into the valley below, where it flowed into the Viscount's dye water. The Viscount slammed the table, furious, demanding to know what Lloyd had done to his workshop. Lloyd answered calmly. The lime in the runoff had altered the dye chemistry, ruined the product, made it worthless. The Viscount shot to his feet, calling Lloyd a brat and swearing he'd sue. Lloyd just smirked. He encouraged it. Go ahead, take him to court. Maybe in 2 years a verdict would be reached. Would the workshop survive until then? The Viscount said nothing. He was sweating now. Lloyd stood to leave, saying if the conversation was over, he'd take his leave. The Viscount warned him he was making enemies. He had powerful friends in the royal court. Lloyd waved lazily with the back of his hand as he walked out, unfazed. As they made their way back, Javier couldn't stay quiet any longer. He asked Lloyd what the point of all that was. All he did was provoke the man. What good would come from antagonising someone with that many royal connections? Lloyd understood where he was coming from, but he told him to just wait and see. He looked ahead with that same self-assured glint in his eye. Let's see, he said. Who really has more to lose? 1 month later, the Viscount was kneeling on the floor of the Frontera Manor. His head bowed, his voice trembling as he begged Lloyd for help. Lloyd sat comfortably in his chair, looking down at him without a hint of urgency. He reminded the Viscount, wasn't this the same man who bragged about his powerful connections? The Viscount apologised profusely, saying he never should have made threats. Lloyd wasn't interested in apologies. What he wanted was a signature. He held out a contract, one that would have the Viscounty of Lacona purchase water directly from the Frontera barony. Lloyd smiled. If he signed it, water would be flowing back to the dye workshop within a week. The Viscount flipped through the pages, face paling as he read the terms. He protested. The price was far too high. Who even puts a price on water? Lloyd leaned forward slightly, gaze sharp and steady. Strange, he said. The one who taught him water wasn't free, was now the one begging for it. Later in Arcos's study, the Baron stared at the contract in disbelief. The monthly payment from Lacona was enormous. At this rate, their debt would be gone in no time. Lloyd stood nearby, grinning ear to ear. He called the Viscount generous, barely able to hold back a laugh. That grin only grew more sinister. The contract had no end date, no escape clause. The Viscount had started this, but now Lloyd would bleed the entire bloodline dry. Arcos looked up at Lloyd, who was still lost in thought, that unnerving smile stretched wide across his face. He said plainly that Lloyd's face was starting to scare him. That snapped Lloyd out of it. He blinked, then brought both hands to his face, trying to reset his expression and force himself back to normal. Arcos continued. The gold they'd received from the Orc tribe, Count Cremo had sent an offer to purchase it. Lloyd raised an eyebrow. Why would someone that wealthy want beaten-up gold? He could easily afford freshly minted bullion instead. Arcos admitted he didn't know. All he knew was that Cremo had offered a generous sum, and said he needed the gold to build a statue. Meanwhile, in the coastal city of commerce known as Cremo, Count Cremo stood before a wide window, gazing out at the moonlit sea. The water was calm under the pale glow of the night sky, waves gently brushing the shore in rhythmic silence. Then, without warning, the surface shifted. The Count narrowed his eyes. Something massive began to emerge from the depths. A sudden roar shook the harbour, as a giant creature burst out of the ocean, with towering force, water crashing around its colossal frame. While Lloyd basked in the success of his latest schemes, a monster had already emerged from the sea near Cremo. Whether he knew it or not, his next problem was already waiting.